What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another logical, plausible, probable after show. It's a great debate over on Standing for Truth between Dr. Ron Garret and the one and only Dr. Kent Hovind on is there evidence for evolution. Now, it was pretty interesting back and forth from both of them. I was very intrigued to see how that one was going to go down. They had covered a lot of different subject matter throughout the course of the night. Personally, I think there was tons of time actually spent on the real question regarding, the evidence for or against evolution. But I thought they had a very interesting back and forth conversation. All right, so folks who want to come on in and share your opinion, the link is in the live chat. I'm posting it again right now. So if you want to come on and share your opinion, click that. We got Guzman. Looks like he's coming in here. Hang on one second. All right, what's up, Guzman? Welcome to the after show. How you doing, man?
Not bad. How about you?
Oh, hanging in there, man. It's another interesting debate there over on SFT. Look, pretty good turnout. There was I got up to like 120 people watching that debate. That was a good one.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. Yeah. I'm only going to be on here for like 2 minutes because it's really late over here. But I just want to, if you don't mind, I wanted to point out a couple of things that I thought were pretty funny.
Yeah, go ahead. Tell us what you thought.
I think that Ron, I think he cited like Wikipedia, like he said that go look at Wikipedia or check it out or something, like probably 15 times in the debate, and it's like that's your source.
I did hear Wikipedia be cited several times for sure.
Yeah.
Although in fairness to Ron, he did clarify at the end that he said they also have links to scientific sources on those Wikipedia articles.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, that was one of the things that I thought was funny. Also, I think Ron, when somebody asked Kent, they asked how, if you were to find a fossil, how would you know if it was a dinosaur? And Ron, I think he misspoke and said, well, dinosaurs aren't reptiles. I think what you wanted to say is that dinosaurs aren't lizards. And so, which I am not against personally, like, but okay. Like it was just, but overall, it was a pretty good debate. I think that Kent did really well. I think Ron did really well, and I think it was a very respectable conversation between the two. And you did a pretty good job moderating, and SFT did a good job, basically making sure that they were staying in time, so that no scheduling conflicts could occur. So yeah, I think it was.
I love hammering them in the comment section with links. Hey, have you seen that Ian Juby thing on Polystrate fossils, Guzman? The Wazaloo, Ian Juby from Wazaloo channel. Have you seen that? That is awesome, isn't it, man? I mean, he really kills it on the Polystrate fossils, mate. I mean, there's just I believe there's no comeback to that whatsoever. He's really killed it. He's like they'll say they'll look at a bunch of broken up pieces of bone that don't even fit together on a table and say they know exactly what that is, but then they'll look at a Polystrate fossil like what Ian's Juby, the way he describes it is just perfect, and they'll say oh that's not right because of this, that, and that, you know what I mean? And it's as clear once you see it and he points it out to you and you can see it. It's amazing. It's really clear. So I've always wanted an Evo to have a go at me on Polystrate fossils, but they don't seem to want to take it there for some reason lately.
Yeah. I think I did see that video. But yeah.
Real quick, everybody.
I'll post it in the live chat.
Real quick, folks, before I forget, got Jungle Jargon and Ontangelo has also joined us. And Ontangelo, just so everybody knows, has a debate, I believe, tomorrow night over on Modern Day Debate on intelligent design. And you're taking on Leo Folius again for round 2, aren't you?
Yes.
I can't post it.
It's about abiogenesis.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll be signing off here, guys.
Can you guys hear me well?
Yep.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll be signing off here, guys. God bless you. Good job moderating, John.
I appreciate it, man. You have a great night.
On the panel. See you.
All right, then Luke just joined us as well. How you doing, Luke?
Doing well. How are you?
Hanging in there. What did you think about the? I think this is the first time you've you come on the stream, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm a friend of Ron's. I actually came up with a question I've never seen asked before, and that is, if all these fossils came from Noah's flood, where are the human tools that are interspersed in the geological record? You know, they'd be spread about, right?
Good question.
I would assume so. I mean, I don't know. The Guzman actually knows a lot of that stuff. Jason, you know some of that stuff as well, don't you?
Yeah. But what did he say again? What was your question again?
So Noah's flood, I mean, there are a bunch of humans using tools, and, you know, civilization is destroyed, whole bunch of fossils that come from that. Where are all the human tools interspersed with the fossils?
Well, they've found a lot of stuff, but the problem is with the animals. As the flood rose, first it buried the Cambrian creatures, which were at the bottom, and then it rose up and it buried each ecological system as it rose. But see, humans were smarter, and so the animals that were smarter and faster, like the mammals and the dinosaurs and the humans, they got up high before the flood got them. And when the flood eventually got them, they got up pretty high, most of them. And that's why we don't find. That's why mammal fossils only make up less than 1%, like 0.02% or 0.2% or something like that of the complete fossil record. Because what happened was, you've got mud flows. Like they had a mud flow in off the coast of California, I think it was. That was, and I heard this from Ken Hovind, by the way. He explained this in a real good description too. It went, this mud flow, they knew exactly how high it was and how fast it was traveling, because it was cutting. It was about 100 meters high, the wall of mud, and it was traveling at 160 kilometers an hour under the water, the mud flow. Now you can imagine a 100-meter high wall of mud traveling at 160 kilometers an hour. Now you work that out back to the global flood. You would have had mud flows traveling at hundreds of kilometers an hour, 100 kilometers an hour, 100 miles an hour, whatever, everywhere. You know, you would have had so if they got caught in the higher up, they would just be ground up into dust, and we'd hardly find any. They'd just be ground up into paste. We'd hardly find any bones. Like, that's what we'd expect, not to find bones, that many of them, and that's exactly what we see.
But the humans, when they're fleeing, they would leave some of their iron and other metal tools behind, right?
They have found some artifacts, but iron and that and things, they break down. Like if you put bones in the ground, and they're not fossilized, they don't have mineralized water dripping through them, they will turn into dust within 1,000 years. So, and we find things like Neanderthal bones that are only partially fossilized. So if these things were 200,000 years old, and they're literally only partially fossilized, they're almost, some of the bones they find are almost entirely unfossilized. So how did it last 200,000 years? You've just got to ask yourself these questions. It's ridiculous.
Well,
Yeah,
how
and even
about
if-
jellyfish? How can jellyfish be fossilized? I mean, it's
Yes.
not.
We
not
do have
hard
jellyfish
bone.
fossilized. Yep.
Yeah, it's not hard bone, so only a rapid burial explains it.
But there are lots of ways to get rapid burials other than a global flood, right? You can have local floods, you can have all sorts of things.
And if anything ever is found, they discount it and make excuses for why it's there. Anyway.
I've got a link I'll post to you. It's about the what do they call it? Malachite man. Now I've got it all written
Jason,
out.
I made you a mod so you can post that link.
Thanks, man. Don, I wrote out the entire video of what Don Patton said, so you don't have to sit there and watch the whole video. You can just read it in like 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and it's a the way he describes it, the evolutionist explanation for the malachite man and the 10 bodies they found, non-articulated bodies or articulated or whatever it was, I can't remember, bodies that they found just didn't make sense. And the way he described it, I mean, the thing is, unless you're there to see it, it's like the Paluxy River prints. Unless you're there the day that they uncover them to see them, you're not going to see the detail. And cameras often don't pick up the detail. And the thing is, those fossils, they decayed, they decay very rapidly from carbonic acid and stuff like that. So they just break down within days to weeks. They start breaking down within days. And so you can't see them. And then after about 20 or 30 years, you go and look at them, they just look like a hole full of gravel. There's hardly anything there. They found that they've got a footprint, and I'll just finish after I say this. They've got a footprint that looks really sort of odd shaped, but it's very clearly a human footprint. You can see the toes. And one Evo professor, where he was giving a lecture at a university with 1,000 people in the audience, and one Evo professor in the audience stood up and he said, well, the foot must have been carved in. And so Don Patton said, I'm glad you asked that. So he earlier on, he'd cross-sectioned the foot with a water saw, with a fine, sharp water saw. And there's and where it cuts, you can see these little pressure lines in the mud beneath the foot, which proves it was laid down exactly at the same time as the dinosaur. So then the professor stood up and said, well, the toes must have been carved on later. And Don Patton said, well, I'm glad you said that, because it turns out that we did cross-section the toes as well, and they found the same thing, which proved that the toes weren't carved on later. Then he said, well, the foot's an odd shape. No human foot is shaped like that. And he said, well, once again, I'm glad you asked that, because they got these concrete pits of wet concrete, and they got kids to run through them all and have a guess what? One print in all of those concrete pits with all those hundreds of prints. One print looked identical, absolutely identical to the footprint he found, the fossilized footprint he found. And he found that footprint right next to dinosaur footprints. So, go believe whatever you like. If you believe evolution, when you see stuff like that, then, anyway, humans live with dinosaurs.
It doesn't matter what they find. They're just discarded.
Artifacts. Artifacts are just... Mate, they're going to break down. I mean, look how fast iron breaks down and things break down. I mean, they've got a bell that they found in a chunk of coal, which has got a type of alloy in the metal that they've never seen before, that we don't use on Earth today. And it's got a pagan symbol on the top. It looks like an angel, but it's not an angel. It's a pagan symbol, and it's like an actual bell. It's not some thing that you can hardly see. It just looks like a bell that your grandma would have sitting on a dinner table or on the kitchen to ring it for dinner or something. It's and that was in a giant block of coal the size of a football, and it was broken open, and the bell was inside of that coal. So
there's this park right by my house, and it's by the beach, and they've got this huge whale bone sitting out there, and the top of the bone totally checking. I think it's a massive rib bone. It's huge, and there's also a whale skull. And I asked them, said, hey, how long has that bone been out there like that in the sun? And they said, oh, it's been up there for about 20 years. And the bone's already just almost totally destroyed on the top of it. So, I mean, you couldn't get a dog bone to last. And I need to take a picture of it. They put some sort of lacquer all over the skull of this whale to protect it. But it's not really doing much. I mean, there's no way something like that. I mean, even if it did fossilize, right, it's already been destroyed. So a smaller bone, that's not going to last out there in the sun.
That's awesome information, dude.
Yeah, there's no way you could explain like one of these fish bones. I mean, put a fish out in your backyard and see how long those bones last. They're not going to last.
See how long a deer lasts that gets run over by the highway.
Yeah, there's just no bones anywhere, even on the bottom of the ocean, out in the woods. I've got a big piece of property like you, Jungle, and there's no bones anywhere. They're all gone. There's nothing. Good luck finding one.
Oh yeah, 60 million bison were supposedly shot by the American settlers, up to 60 million. And according to evolution, we should see just bison bones laying everywhere out there. And it's only 200 years or I don't know how long American history. I'm not right up on. I know more about American history than most Americans, but I don't know the exact time. 200 and something years ago, and there's not, and they go there, they can't find any of these bones in 200 years. But these bones laid on the ground for millions of years. No.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, this whale rib, I mean, it's massive. It's bigger than your thigh. And in 20 years, the top of it is chalked so bad you could put a coin in there. So
Wow.
think of the smaller bones sitting out there. It's just not going to happen. But I kind of want to just, Ron's he seems like a really nice guy, and my heart always kind of breaks for these guys when I hear that.
And they found, sorry to cut you off just before I forget, they found an entire valley that they thought were bison bones, but later on they discovered they were dinosaur bones, and they were on top of the thing, and some of them were only partially fossilized and not fossilized. And of course they buried this, and yet they don't find 60 million bison bones. That is just mind-blowing, man. It's like they hide all this stuff. They bury it. Google has been removing stuff like this. Evidence used to be freely available on the internet, and Google has been censoring it and removing it or making it very hard to find.
Yeah.
So if there's petrified trees, there should be petrified human wood structures too, right?
No, not necessarily, because we don't find how many polystrate fossils do we know. It's because a human structure would be broken up. I mean, when water hits it, it's going to be smashed to pieces. A tree is a solid hunk of wood.
Yeah, did you ever see a house get destroyed by a mudslide?
Yeah, by a tidal wave. You go and have a look at the Indonesian flood.
What about a log cabin or something like that? I mean,
yeah, well, it'd break up into different logs, and you'd find the log in the ground.
Yeah, it's going to rot. I mean, it's going to just get destroyed. It's going to get rotted. It's going to get termited. I mean, if it's not buried,
it's going to get ground up in the flood. All sorts of things, man. You imagine mud flows moving at hundreds of kilometers an hour, with boulders the size of houses being tumbled along in these mud flows, and just boulders and mate, it's a miracle anything survived. About the only thing that really survived were the hard shells. There's trillions upon trillions upon trillions of fossils on Earth, but most of them are shellfish. Sorry, 99.something% of them are shellfish.
Yeah, but even these shells don't last long, especially on the beach. They get beat.
I've seen them break down, mate.
Yeah.
Yep, I've seen shells. I used to live on a beach and a river that ran next to it, a muddy river, and I used to dig up shells out of the mud when I was digging for like pumping for yabbies to go fishing with, saltwater yabbies, and I'd pull up shells that were buried in the mud, obviously for a long time, but I'd pull them up and they're all rot. You'd pick them up and they'd just crush like flat, like tissue paper. Sometimes.
Yeah, or they'll get chalky. People make art out of shells, and it doesn't last very long. Just like that bone, it's not going to last very long out in the sun. It's just going to get.
They've got shells 800 meters above sea level right here in Tasmania. There's a video you can look at, and he pulls them out of the mountain 800 meters above sea level, and they're all chalky and soft. But as he digs in, they're right deep all the way through the mountain. So,
Hey, I just want to talk about Ron's opening. When I was listening to it, it just seemed like he had just one, faulty appeal after the next. First he wants to appeal to the majority of scientists, and if you think about that logically, Darwin's theory would have never taken off, right? And the moon would still be a perfectly smooth glass sphere. It's everything, so he appeals to the majority, which is that's a problem if you think about it. And then he did the true Scotsman fallacy, saying that there's no papers, right, for creation. And he as he was going on, he was all.
Yeah, that information, those sources are the very thing that we're putting into question, that we question their work and the results and their assertions. That's what we're questioning, and all they have is more assertions. I mean, each paper is just built on. Do you guys
know why there are no creationist papers in secular peer-reviewed journals?
Well, they have to be accepted. They have to be.
You want to ask Salvador Cordova about that? You want to ask Salvador Cordova that question? But I'll let others answer that one. But if you really want to know a good explanation to that one, ask Sal.
Well, I know right off the bat they're not going to accept somebody like Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's technical papers that, in my opinion, can't be refuted on the Y chromosome, for example, and the genetic signatures discovered in the Y chromosome, because his papers actually question the deep time and questions universal common ancestry. In secular peer-reviewed journals, yeah, they might allow you to question little bits of the story here and there, but they won't allow you to actually question the bigger picture. And that's what these creation scientists are doing. That's what Nathaniel Jensen is doing. So when they say, oh, how come you're not publishing in peer-reviewed journals? It's like, it just makes me laugh, because that's one of the big reasons.
It has to be endorsed by other scientists too, and they don't want to destroy their career by endorsing you.
Well, I think it's disingenuous too, especially for someone like him who knows the evidence is out there. I mean, he knows that we have sources that will review stuff. It's theirs, but it's just not honest.
Why aren't there any creationist journals to compete? I don't know that any exist, do they?
Well,
there are. Yeah.
I think it's 70% of creationists, 80% of Juno. Sorry, my dog was sniffing. Hang on. 70% of creationists have won all the. Christians are the ones that won most of the Nobel prizes. So.
Yeah, 65%.
I've got the evidence of that, by the way.
Yeah, 65%.
And I mean, if you look at Dr. Carter, Dr. Sanford, I mean, you can look at all these young Earth creation scientists. They're all publishing in peer-reviewed journals. It might not necessarily be something to do with young Earth creation, but I mean, Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins, he ran a genomics center for years. He's extremely qualified. He's overturned the chromosome 2 fusion single-handedly, but he's got many peer-reviewed publications. So I think it's Dr. Jerry Bergman has 12 degrees. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, I'm just thinking a journal that's specifically devoted to creationism, to help refine the arguments and peer review them, and do the same thing that other scientists do, but creationists.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, you can find the answers in Genesis Journal, for example. That's a creation peer-reviewed journal. You can look at the technical papers there. And what's interesting, especially Dr. Jensen, he welcomes criticism of his technical papers, as long as, for example, there's an evolutionary biologist, and I think he's also a botanist, Dr. Stephen Frello. I debated him on Modern Day Debate. He's published. He's a critic of creation. He's published in the AIG journal, and he's had a written back and forth criticism with Dr. Jensen. You can read it. I think it's 150 pages or something. It's a really good technical read, but there's a lot going on in these peer-reviewed creation journals. So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah,
Isn't ICR another one? Institute of Creation Research.
Yeah,
I think if somebody from ICR wants to publish in a peer-reviewed journal, I think they go into the AIG journal, because I know Jeffrey Tompkins is associated with ICR, but I see him publishing in the AIG journal. So I think I'm not sure if ICR has their own journal.
Well, one of the things I find very entertaining about the standard talking point of why aren't you in Nature, right? Or whatever, insert whatever secular journal name is. It's like, guys, we live in the era of modern tech, and it's called the internet. You can go read the paper on this website, and then if you have a problem with it, issue your formal rebuttal like you would in any other context.
Right, exactly.
Don't just discount whether or not the argument's being made and have the standard talking point is, well, when are the people who believe in God going to do some scientific research? And it's like, well, they're publishing it. It's online. You can access it for free, dumbass. You don't even have to have a subscription to the journal to go and read the paper. And then if you have a problem with it, write a response. It's not rocket science, folks.
If the critics have a problem with the testable predictions coming from, I mean, there's been countless testable predictions in all fields. Dr. John Baumgartner predicted the cold slabs based on the global flood model. Those were discovered. Dr. Russell Humphreys, he has made numerous predictions. For example, helium in rocks, as well as the magnetic fields of some of the planets in our solar system. And now we've got Dr. Jensen making numerous testable predictions, some of them coming true. So you're right, John. The critic, instead of complaining, they can go write a rebuttal. And that's the problem is, from us creationists, we don't see any rebuttals. That's what's funny. It's like, man, these arguments and these predictions that are being confirmed are going unchallenged by the evolutionist community. So either they're just ignoring them, they don't know about them, or they know they can't refute them.
It'd be interesting to publish a top 10 list to challenge them. We're not going to give you tons and tons, but top 10 list and see what they respond to that.
That's a good point. That's a good
top
point.
100, top 1,000. We got a lot of predictions that have. I mean, what's his name? That guy that did the flood model.
Dr. John Baumgartner.
No, the one that we always refer to that created the heavy elements. I can't believe that skipped out of my mind. So this
Dr.
is
Walt
Brown.
Walt Brown.
Oh God, I've lost what I was going to say. And
Walt
this is why I don't debate.
Jason.
No, I forgot what I was going to say about Walt Brown. See, this is why I don't debate. So you always ask me why I don't debate. That's why.
No, Jason, you're a good debater. So I guess because it's an after show, what did everybody, or maybe I missed when you guys talked about that. What did everybody think of the debate? How do you think Ron did? How do you think Kent did?
Well, Ron didn't present anything.
Yeah, we got started
Kent
using a
killed
good
it.
point about Ron quoting Wikipedia like 5 times.
Yeah.
But yeah, overall, I mean, I thought it was an interesting back and forth. I felt like there was definitely a portion that was it was like neither one of them was actually discussing evidence for evolution. It was much more of a philosophical discussion for a portion of it.
Right.
I mean,
And
we got
you
it
did
back
a
on
good
track,
job
obviously,
pondering.
but there was definitely some philosophy going down in there a little bit.
Well, I think that's a good observation, and I got nothing bad to say about Ron or Ken. I think it was a really good, respectful debate. It was really enjoyable to listen to, and for my channel at least, it was a record in the audience. I think we had like 120 people, and I think they both did a good job. I always enjoy Kent. I mean, he's one of my favorite debaters. He's always entertaining, and his opening and his rebuttal really consisted of showing why. No, there really isn't any reasonable evidence for evolution, and even gave some really solid evidence for the flood, for example, and the creation model. And Ron, and nothing against him, his response was, "Well, I'm not a geologist," or he didn't really have any responses, and he kind of went down the philosophy route. And Kent even pointed out, Kent said, "Well, that's not the topic of the debate. It's your burden to demonstrate evidence for evolution. But okay, I'll take this rabbit trail," he said. So it was almost like maybe Ron, I don't know if he was trying to go down a route he felt more comfortable with. But I did find near the end, he at least attempted a little bit more to give some evidence for evolution. So, yeah, that's a good observation, John.
Now, George, you just came on. What was your thoughts on the debate, and then on Tangelo? Let me hear what you thought after George goes.
I heard Ron mention that there was overwhelming evidence for evolution, yet I don't believe I heard one piece of evidence. But just to go back a little bit on what Jason and some of the others were talking about fossils, I recently had a discussion with someone on Facebook about opalized fossils. I showed a picture of an insect that was completely fossilized in an opal, and I said, "Can you tell me how that happened?" He says, "How do I know?" He says, "You've just shown a photo without any captions or links or whatever." So I actually then linked to a study that was commissioned by the Australian government on that particular find and others. And he said, and you know what he said? He said, "Well, what do you know?" The study actually said that these fossils could only have formed within weeks to a month. And his reply was, "Well, what do you know?" He says, "There is more than one way you can create a fossil." That was his answer.
Talking about flash fossilization, I'm going to post another link in the chat. They always say this is an Evo link, and it shows this guy's got a fish. He can see the structures inside of the cells of the fish. It fossilized that fast. The fish. It literally, he did tests and he put it in the laboratory. I'll put the link up in a second. He did tests. He put it up in a laboratory and he, did all different decay rates and put it in different conditions. And he said at the end of it, he concluded it had to fossilize within about 3 hours. Completely fossilized. So that'll give you an idea. Like opals can form. Opals can be made. You can't tell the difference between the natural one and the unnatural one. So, and diamonds can be made, all sorts of things. So all of this stuff taking millions of years. Also on the Proton 21 laboratory, when they did these tests, when they did these electricity tests with large amounts of electricity, they created all the elements of the periodic table in the laboratory. 5,000 times they've done this experiment and recreated it. And each element, like say uranium, decayed down within hours to days, some elements, to the exact proportions we find those elements on Earth today. So uranium decays into lead, and we got a certain amount of uranium and a certain amount of lead on Earth. And in this laboratory test, when they created all the elements of the periodic table in the laboratory with electricity, the elements decayed down in exactly the same proportions as what we find uranium and lead on Earth today in the laboratory within hours. So goodbye dating method.
Great point. That's a great point. What do you think, Antangelo?
Well, I joined just at the end of the debate. What I usually observe with Kent is that I don't know if it's true, but I've never seen him going to the molecular level and explaining the mechanisms of evolution on the level of biochemistry. So I think that the real mechanisms, they apply and occur at that level. And if you want to understand what actually happens, then you have to go to that level. And I think Sal and John, I've seen some inputs of you. Maybe you guys have some understanding on that. But when you start to debate fossils and that kind of stuff, that's not where the mechanisms are. So,
you don't have any mechanisms.
Yeah, I would say with fossils and flood geology and the age of the Earth, I mean, Kent, anybody who goes down the flood route or the age of the Earth route with Kent, they're going to lose. It's going to be a mistake. And that's why when Ron attempted to go down that route, Kent was boom, he had his slides. That's his expertise. And Kent takes away the age. So if you take away the age and you prove a global flood, evolution can't be true. They need deep time. So I would kind of disagree with you there, because Kent, he doesn't really. That's not his. Everybody has their own style. He'll go into genetics, maybe the basics of it, but he likes to go right at the heart of evolution and take away their time. And also, I personally think Kent's one of the best at debating the flood. And I think he took away any reasonable evidence for evolution by attacking geology with Ron. So I thought that was a good strategy, to be honest with you.
Actually, talking about the flood, and I think it was John Jargon mentioned Don Patton. I don't know if you guys know about that Navy expedition in Turkey in 2010. And then Don Patton claimed that it was a hoax. Are you familiar with that story?
Are you talking about the finding Noah's Ark in Turkey?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that, yeah.
So I've met about 2 months ago on Facebook Philip Williams, which actually went to Turkey, and he visited the site, and there are videos of the place. And I investigated this for about 1 month and a half, and I'm convinced now that the site is real. It's not a hoax.
Yeah, well, sometimes they'll say they're not convinced it's convincing evidence to use against evolutionists, even though they still might believe it, but they say it's not good enough or convincing enough to use in an argument. But that doesn't mean it's not evidence, though,
Right.
Well, it's one of the pieces in the puzzle. I mean, if Noah's flood happened, then this means that the 6,000 years and the Genesis story becomes much more real, and
right.
that of course also relates to the whole evolution story of millions of years.
Well, especially if they want to look to the fossil record as evidence for fish to fisherman, pond scum to people evolution. If you can demonstrate in a debate that those fossils are better explained under a flood model and burial by, say, ecosystems and communities, then that does take away their evolutionary story. And what I like to typically go down in any field, I like to stick to genetics, but even in flood geology, I like to go down to the gold standard of science, which is testable predictions. We were talking about that earlier, and I like to bring up, and Brother Neff brought this up against R.J. Downard in their most recent debate, and it's just so funny watching them struggle to explain it, because it was Dr. John Baumgartner. He came up with the catastrophic plate tectonics model, and he suggested that if this model is true and those plates are being pushed down, well, according to our model of 6,000 years, they would not have had time to melt yet. So he predicted that if this were the case, there should be huge slabs of cold rock at the base of the mantle. So he made this prediction, and it didn't have to come true. Years later, the field of seismic tomography came about, and they actually detected these huge slabs of cold rock at the base of the mantle, which means they haven't had enough time to melt, which means they were just pushed down there recently. So, I mean, that's literally a testable prediction based on flood geology. And isn't it the evolutionists and the uniformitarians that are the ones saying, oh, creationists aren't making testable predictions? It's like, well, there's one, and there's one that didn't have to be true, yet it came true. So it's fascinating.
To have a link of that work?
That's what I was going to say. Walt Brown made hundreds of not hundreds, or a lot. He made so many we couldn't fit them all in our book. And very specific predictions, very specific ones, and he was just spot on. It's so many times. So when you've got a guy making so many predictions, we can't fit them all in our book, and they're very specific ones and spot on. Then, mate, I'm going with Walt Brown.
And brother Otalang, yeah, I could send you those papers and work by, well, I mean, even with the RATE team, radioisotopes and the age of the Earth, it was not only Dr. Baumgartner, but it was Dr. Snelling, Dr. Humphreys, and going into it, they predicted, okay, if the global flood did occur and radioisotope decay was accelerated, we should find evidence in the rocks for accelerated nuclear decay. So that's another thing they went into, and they didn't have to discover evidence, and yet they did. They discovered, I think it was like a 7-year research project, but they came out of it. They discovered radio halos, which is just damage in the rocks, indicative of accelerated nuclear decay. They discovered fission tracks, helium in crystals. Helium is incredibly slippery. So in deep time evolution, there should be no helium found in rocks. It should have all dissipated into the atmosphere, and yet there was high levels of helium detected. So all of these predictions were future and novel, and then they were confirmed years later, that's the gold standard of science. I mean, if the evolutionists are not making better testable predictions, then they don't have the better model and they don't have the better science.
And Jensen made all those predictions about, how many predictions has Jensen got right so far?
Exactly.
About mutation rates and that.
Right. Well, he's made future novel ones on the Khoisan peoples, African people groups where the mutation rate is not yet known. And until we get the DNA of some of these African people groups, we're not going to know if it's true or not, but he's confident, I'm confident that it is true. Evolutionists admit that they can't make those predictions because they assume that the mutation rate was slower in the past. It's fast now, and it's indicative of a Eve ancestor of 6,000 years, but because they assume deep time evolution, well, now they have to say and resort to rescue devices. Oh, the mutation rate was slower in the past, but yet they've got no testable predictions. Dr. Jensen does have predictions, but he's made predictions also on the Y chromosome, and that's what his new series is about. Is he's discovering the history of civilization within the Y chromosome. He's looking at population histories, population genetics, genetic signatures, and stuff. So his research program is just starting. So every year he's gonna come out with more and more confirmed predictions. It's a great time.
So SFT. So Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal has entered the building and is saying that you're confounding mutation rates and substitution rates. So Dan, I upgraded my account. I can have a couple more folks on if you want to come on. I know SFT's got to bounce here in a minute, so
I can leave.
I've got a couple. I have a couple more
There's
slots.
room. I think there's room.
No, there's room. No, I'm telling Dr. Dan that he wants to hop on real quick. He better hurry up because SFT's about to bounce.
I will leave. It's late.
No, nobody has to leave.
But,
I've got space. I'm talking about SFT's gonna have to leave shortly. There's space. Nobody needs to leave.
Yeah, he's got to go because he's busy.
Yeah, I'll stay another 10 minutes. No
or
problem.
tired.
While you're waiting for that, Angela, on the evidence for the Ark, they actually found, I'm aware you're aware of this, they found the ballast stones. They know that these ballast stones were used to stabilize a ship during inclement weather, and they've done the models on in flume tests where they actually prove that these ballast stones can actually stabilize a ship the size of the Ark to minimize the amount of sway in waves and water action.
Yeah, and they were actually used back in the ancient times too. It's not only that they exist, but they were actually used.
Yeah. Oh, our friend Tony's in the chat.
G'day, fellas.
What's up, Tony? So you didn't show up for the Smoky Saint and Anthony stream. What happened, man?
Oh man, it was just ridiculous. My mum got out of hospital and I had to do a bunch of stuff. It just got more and more ridiculous the whole day.
Gotcha. Well, I'm glad your mom's doing okay.
I did email Smokey, so hopefully he got my email. But yeah, no, I just couldn't do it.
Okay, gotcha. Well, we're having a little conversation about the. Dr. Dan's coming in. Hang on one sec. Let me add him in.
Hello.
Hello, Dan.
Okay, I'm leaving you guys to it because I'll be useless in this. See ya. Love you guys. God bless. See ya.
All right, see you, Jason.
See you, Jason.
Peace out, Jason. Dan, the man with the plan. How you doing?
Thank you all for having me on. I gotta go to bed soon, so I wanted to make this quick. There's a very quick thing though, but this is a thing that Jensen. By the way, what's the right pronunciation there? I've heard him introduced both ways.
Jensen.
I think I've been saying it wrong, to be honest with you. Yeah, I think it's Jensen. I've heard
Jensen.
Dr. Purdom say Jensen. I usually say Jensen. Seems to come out easier, but
I've literally heard him introduce both. We'll say Jensen. So this is a thing that Jensen gets wrong. It's that when you're doing like coalescence calculations, you can't use the per replication mutation rate because we're multicellular. So most of those mutations don't get passed on. They get weeded out in the germline bottleneck. So like you can't do calculations based on that. And he says that in his 2015 paper.
Well, what
he says it.
Well, what he says is he doesn't assume the deep time geological column. So he's looking at pedigree-based studies. He's looked at multi-generational studies, and it's consistent with a 6,000-year time frame. So why would he? Well, real quick. Why would he then calibrate the data with the deep time evolutionary story? That doesn't even make any sense because it's the deep time.
So I have an answer
question
for you.
that's being. Oh,
so
go ahead.
First, let me tell you what he wrote, because he actually correctly identifies the problem. He said, the only remaining caveat to the present results is whether the mutation rate reported in Ding et al. 2015 represents a germline rate rather than a somatic mutation rate. To confirm germline transmission in the future, the DNA sequences from at least 3 successive generations must be sequenced to demonstrate that variants were not artifacts of mutation accumulation in non-gonadal cells. In other words, that the data that he used from the Ding 2015 pedigree study, it's all mutations in the mitochondrial DNA.
Well, you realize he's used more than just one study, right? Like
the other ones had
he's looked at multi. It just seems like you're real quick. It just seems like you're cherry picking because I actually just talked to Jensen 2 days ago, and he's Are you a virologist?
I am. The other two
Okay,
studies
so yeah,
he used had
he's
zero.
aware of your
Zero.
arguments that are claiming that he's using a mutation rate that is 35 times faster than the published one. But the fact is, Dan, if you look at if you look at these published papers and the published rates, the dates derived are always assuming the millions of years, and then they're
That's
fitting
not true
the facts.
also, but that's a separate issue. That's also
it's not a separate
true,
issue
that's a
because
separate issue.
Well, real
First,
quick, before you can, no, I just want to see if you have read the book. Can you name?
I have read the book. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, can you reiterate maybe like 3 of the 10 predictions that he?
No, because that's not what I. If you don't want to talk about the mutation rate thing, you don't have to. But
no,
I just want to point
it comes
out
down to testable prediction. So yes, real quick, and then I'll give you as much time as you want. So you can look to substitution rates. You can say natural selection was more efficient in the past. You can say mutation rates were slower in the past. But without testable predictions that flow from those explanations, it's just non-science. Dr. Jensen,
from the book
real quick, I know you're excited, Dan. Real quick, and then you can go. Dr. Jensen, in print, he said, I'm so confident with the rate that I'm using that I can make future testable predictions on mutation rates in African people groups where we don't know their mutation rates. And he's done it. And for one, you're not even reiterating even one of the predictions. So that makes me question if
I'm not talking about the book.
And secondly, he's also made predictions on the history of civilization. If these DNA differences really do go back 4,500 years, then we should be able to detect the history of civilization in our genome. And he's already discovering genetic stamps in the Y chromosome. So it comes, I understand what you're saying about substitution rates and calibrating the dates and so on and so forth, but without any actual testable predictions, it doesn't really matter, Dan. So you can go over your explanation, but you need testable predictions to flow from those explanations. Go ahead, Dan, go ahead.
So 2 things. One,
I will quit here, okay?
On AIG, it's called Young Earth Creation Human Mitochondrial DNA Clock.
I've read it. Yeah, I've read it.
Okay. So in that, he referenced 3 studies, Ding 2015 and 2 others. It's, let's see, I got the table right here. It's Guo 2013 and Robledo Jaramillo 2014. Both of those 2 other ones have 0 samples that he used because they did not distinguish between homoplasmic and heteroplasmic samples, whereas Ding did. So he only used
He's considered heteroplasmy too, though.
He only used the 63 samples from Ding. Now, this is a pedigree study, so you're looking at parents and their children. In looking at the differences between parents and children, you sweep in all of the differences, whether they're germline inherited or not. So, like, for example, if I have a mutation in my skin cells, and my daughter doesn't have that same mutation, that's going to count as a difference, even though that was not inherited from me to her, right? So you're including a lot of mutations that are not going to accumulate over generations in that count. And in doing so, you're going to overestimate the per generation rate of accumulation. That's the fundamental problem with what Jensen does. He overestimates the rate by
what Jensen
mutations.
says is, he says perhaps we should look at changes in heteroplasmic mutations rather than changes in What's that?
Irrelevant. It doesn't matter for this question. That's a separate thing from germline versus somatic. It's a separate question.
If he's predicting accurately, then that says something. If he's predicting accurately,
he's not predicting it accurately because
he's all well. Here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. He is the one that's making the testable predictions. He's the one that has an active research program, and we're just using the empirical rate.
Well, he didn't generate these data. These are someone else's data.
He's looking at numerous. Well, here's the thing.
He's not doing the research. He's just playing with the numbers.
Right, but I'm trying to tell you. I'm not sure if you're aware because you. I mean, do you know any of the predictions that he's put? Because the thing, we're just talking past each other. If you don't know.
I'm not here to talk about
the book. I'm going to make a quick injection here because you guys are going back and forth here. The one thing that really irritates the fire out of me is, somebody's just playing with the data. That is literally what is being done in almost every scenario of bioinformatics. Somebody is playing with the data that's been taken from another source. Anybody that ever does an analysis of anything from the Human Genome Project didn't actually do the research for themselves. So that objection is kind of annoying, and I hear it all the time. And it's like, I can go and do the exact same analysis of data on all sorts of things, and nobody in business and any other industry, and nobody said, you didn't go extract the data yourself, therefore your argument can be false. So anyway, that's my point. Go back to it, guys.
So here's the thing. I'm going to pull up real quick. This is only going to take a second. This is going to be pretty half-assed, but I'm gonna try to make this work. Because what I want to do here is I want to show you graphically what the problem is. So if you'll just indulge me for a second here, and if not, that's perfectly okay, because I appreciate you giving me the time to come on here.
Of course, yeah, you're always respectful, Dan. We don't mind. I don't mind discussing.
So here's what I'm going to do right here, okay? So you've got A, and you've got B, okay? Can you see this? You're not going to be able to see that. I need like a real paper. Hang on a second. Sorry, just a little bit. Here we go. Okay. And I need a Sharpie. Yeah, I got one right here. Okay, so here's the deal, right? So you've got parent and you got offspring. Okay, parent and offspring. Now, the parent passes on alleles to the offspring. Now, within the parent, though, because we're multicellular, right? So the parent's got muscles and neurons and skin, and the parent's got a lot of mutations that happens in those tissues. But only the germline.
In the somatic.
Right, exactly. Now, the same thing happens in the offspring, right? The offspring has a lot of somatic mutations. Jensen's numbers from that DING study, they don't distinguish between the germline mutations and the somatic mutations. So you're counting in that DING study, you're counting a bunch of mutations in the parent that can't get passed on. You're counting a bunch of mutations in the offspring that can't get passed on. And what you're doing by extrapolating that one generation degree of change over many generations is overestimating the per generation rate of change. That's the fundamental problem with what Jensen does with that math. And if you do it correctly and you only count the germline accumulation, you end up with a number that's about 10 times in the more distant past than what he says.
Right, and I understand that. Instead of, I guess, since you're attacking, or I should say criticizing Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's mutation rate, this is what he said to your argument. He said, but for sake of argument, let's conservatively say that this germline to somatic dilemma is enough to prevent us from reliably inferring a mutation rate from the DING study. What does the blog author, which I'm not sure if it was
that me?
Exactly that made this argument, but this argument's been made numerous times, I think from Evograd too. He's saying, what would the critics suggest that we invoke instead?
I'll
the
tell you.
logically circular rate derived from Soares and al. So he's saying if the rate he cited from DING's data is invalid, why does it agree with the 7+ studies that have been previously published? And then he says, why is there such scientific consistency across multiple independent scientific studies? And then from my own words, I'm just saying he's the one that's confident enough where he can make scientific predictions, and you have already, and no offense, you failed to provide any predictions of your own. You're just criticizing him. Yeah. So you can look to heteroplasmy, you can look to criticisms involving substitution rates, somatic mutations, for example. But real quick, because I didn't interrupt you, if there's no testable predictions that can flow from it, okay, his predictions are in print. They're in print, and he's already confirming some of these predictions in the Y chromosome based on the assumption that these DNA differences in the Y chromosome and the mitochondrial DNA only go back 6,000 years. The evolutionists, I understand everything you're saying, and it's nice. You can go on for an hour explaining it, but I have a feeling no testable predictions are going to flow from it because the evolutionists will say there's too many factors at play. So are there predictions coming out from the evolutionist side?
100. So first of all, that is false. There are directly testable predictions within a time interval that I think we all would agree, young Earth or not, is valid. So there are ways, I know calibration is a dirty word in this context, but there are situations that we can use to calibrate what the actual rate is. And I'll go into that in a second, but if you would want me to. But my first thing is, rather than invoking Jensen's authority and saying, well, he's done the work, blah, 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 do you disagree with what I just laid out of the distinction between somatic mutations and germline mutations and how that affects the per generation rate? Do you disagree with that?
I agree with all that. That's why I'm saying everything that everything that Dr. Nathaniel Jensen has considered, studies that have looked at the D-loop region of the mitochondrial DNA, we know those are for sure germ cell line mutations, and those are from multi-generational pedigree-based studies. So all of the data, instead of just like cherry picking one study, all of the data corroborate on one conclusion, and that's a date of 6,000 years.
Nope. So first of all, the D loop is hyper variable, so you can't use that long term because the rate varies in different lineages, so it's not reliable as a molecular
that's an assumption.
clock.
That's an assumption.
No, you could do that, and well, that gets into my next thing: is that how we can actually know what the rate is?
Do you agree that mitochondrial DNA ticks fast when we look at these pedigree-based studies?
Yes, it is faster than nuclear DNA, but that's not relevant for this question. The question is the consistency of the rate, not the absolute speed.
Well, you would have to invoke mutation rates, I think like 10 or 20 times slower to account for the 200,000 year date for mitochondrial leave. I mean, there's no mutation rate slow enough. What's that?
The difference between somatic and germline accounts for that, and we have observed data that show that. And that's the next thing if you want.
Because those slow mutation rates are inferred. I guarantee
they're not. They're directly measured, and I'll tell you how. So what we have is we have dates where we know when humans settled specific places on Earth. So for example, we know the Canary Islands were settled between 2 and 2.3 thousand years ago. We know the island of Vanuatu in the Pacific was settled about 3,000 years ago. These are within young Earth timeframes. I don't think anybody here would dispute these. We know when this stuff was settled, and it was very recent. So given that we know when it was settled and where it was settled from, because it was within recorded history, we can compare the mitochondrial lineages of the island populations to the sister groups, either in nearby Pacific Islands or whatever mainland is closest. We know what it is. Archaeologically, we can figure that out. That gives us a known date. That gives us a known date. So now we can look at the island and we can look at the mainland. I don't know if y'all can see that, but that gives us a known date and a known number, directly measured number of differences. We also know the years, and substitution rates are changes per site in the genome per year. So we have everything we need to directly measure a long-term substitution rate for the mitochondrial genome. Then what we do is we take the two most distinct human mitochondria we can find, and it's like however many differences per genome, and we can use that same long-term rate that we directly calculated, and we can work backwards from those two, say A and C here, those two most distant ones, and we can work backwards to the mitochondrial most recent common ancestor. And when you do that using the directly measured substitution rate, the long-term rate of accumulation of changes, you get between 60 and 200,000 years. There's no inferences there. That is direct measurements. There's no assumption of long-term evolutionary timelines. That's based on recorded human history and directly observed differences.
Well, what's the max amount of DNA differences between any two humans in the mitochondrial DNA?
I think it's about 170 or 180 mutations, I think, but I don't know off the top of my head. I could be off there.
Right. So the fact is there's so few mutations, and we know empirically that the mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA mutates a lot faster than the
substitution rate is what's relevant. That's my point, though, not the mutation rate.
Right. The substitution rate, and you can say that it isn't, the substitution rate is based on a calibration of the geological column. But all Jensen's doing is taking the observed mutation rate based on a number of pedigree based. No, that is all he's doing. He's considered all of these.
Technique. He needs to use the substitution rate.
Yeah. Right. I understand that. That's the criticism he needs to use. But so, for example, he's making.
No, wait. We got to drill down.
I just want to ask you a question. Well, real quick, because I let you talk. I know you're excited. Dan, I just want to ask you a simple question.
But you're changing words though, and I can't follow. Is it mutation or substitution? Which one is appropriate?
Mutation rate.
That's wrong. Substitution rate is appropriate. Mutation rate includes the somatic mutations, so you get the wrong answer. The direct measurements over the long term.
Because all of these studies still corroborate on one key fact, which is a fast mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA.
But that doesn't matter over generations.
Well,
What
it doesn't
matters is
matter
the
over
substitution
generations if you can actually make testable predictions.
Which
because
I just-
I'm saying, yeah, I understand what you're saying about
This is direct measurement.
about the
This is-
substitution rates, but if that substitution rate explanation doesn't make testable predictions, then it's just another form of
does.
pseudoscience. Let's just say this: it can be resolved here. So Jensen's saying he's so confident with the mutation rate he's using, derived from these a number of published papers, that he said, okay, let's take some people groups where their mutation rates have not yet been measured, and I predict their DNA will change this many times, this many
he says it's gonna
generations.
be faster than normal.
Our evolution is doing any of if you can point me to a testable prediction based on what you're saying on substitution rates, then I will consider it a little bit more. Okay.
Well, so first of all, I want to just be clear here. Are we disagreeing about what the appropriate way is to make this kind of measurement, or is the problem with you don't think the right way to do it makes testable predictions? Because those are two different problems. Do we agree on the mutation substitution thing?
I don't agree that the substitution rates, invoking substitution rates, will account for a date of 200,000 years. I believe that the mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA is far too fast, and the max amount of differences between any two humans, which you said is about 170, I think it might be more like 130. That's too few to be accounted for by deep time evolution, is the point. Like, for example, the Parsons paper.
But Standing, if you do this type of thing, which, first of all, do we agree on like the date of the settlement of the Canary Islands about 2,000 years ago, or Vanuatu about 3,000 years ago? We can also use other ways to calibrate this, and this gets into the predictions thing, because we can make other predictions, like Japan was settled about 32,000 years ago, or Europe was settled about 45,000 years ago. Now, I know you don't accept those timeframes, at least I don't think you do, but we can make predictions based on one of these calibrations and say, given that, you can then look at these other populations and say, does it corroborate with the archaeological evidence? And the answer is yes. And in the chat, give me a second and I'll give you a paper on this. Because there is a paper that goes into all of this, and it's crystal clear, and it actually goes through how you can use one calibration to then predict what the other ones are, and they're in line with it. So, I mean, the answer is yes, it does give testable predictions, which have been tested and have been verified. So, I mean, that's the answer to your question.
Wait, so are you saying that there are secular scientists that have published testable predictions
100%.
on people groups where their mutation rates are not yet known?
I wouldn't say people groups, I would say lineages, where you're looking at, like, for example, the lineage that migrated from the Middle East into Europe, and look at the mutation rate in there. Basically, what you're doing is you're able to say, we expect, based on the observed substitution rate in case A, we expect to see this many mutations or this many substitutions in case B and C and D and E, if the archaeological evidence is correct of settlement at this time in the past. And those have been verified experimentally. And I'm just looking up, I just got to chase down the link, but I'm looking up the paper right now for you.
Jump.
Right. So my final word on that, because I can't discuss this all night, my wife's waiting for me, is the fact that mutation rates in the mitochondrial DNA, they are faster than the nuclear DNA, and max amount of DNA. Well, real quick, max amount of DNA differences between any two people are very few, and therefore, to invoke mutation rates or substitution rates, for example, that are not really observable today,
they are observable.
To calibrate with. Well, you're going to have to send me those papers, because the prediction-wise, you'll have to go head-to-head on testable predictions with Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, who's made these novel predictions on people groups whose mutation rate is not yet measured. So I'm guessing, so you're talking about lineages, but if you have a problem with the results from pedigree-based studies, like, for example, the Parsons paper was adopted by the FBI, it's so good and so accurate. But you don't think that's good enough for deep time evolution, because you're saying we have to consider heteroplasmy, we got to consider substitution rates, somatic cell line mutations, for example. Yeah. So papers like the Parsons paper, it's not good enough to come with come to a reasonable date, is what you're saying, more or less.
You can't use generation over generation mutation rates to infer a long-term substitution rate.
That's what I disagree with. That's what and I think.
But we agreed that there are somatic mutations that are going to be swept up in those data that don't persist generation after generation. We agree on that. I think we should agree on that. That's obvious.
But I'm saying that overall, when you consider the somatic cell line mutations, like you're saying, heteroplasmy, substitution rates, it's still all, even you can look at all these pedigree-based studies, they still all corroborate on a fast mutation rate in the mitochondrial
mutation rate,
DNA.
But not substitution. Those are two different measures. By the way, the
so
paper's in the chat.
So would you agree that
Anybody
the empirically observed mutation rate, per generation mutation rate, is fast and only goes back about 6,500 years? But now you're saying
with the first part of that.
Okay,
but not the second. Because
the substitution rate,
a per generation mutation rate, and work backwards, because those mutations only exist in the somatic cells. They don't persist generation over generation. That's the point. And I'm going to say, this is not me.
You're saying because they get weeded out by natural selection?
No, I'm not saying they're weeded out by natural selection. I'm saying they don't exist in the germline. And again, this is not me saying this. This is Jensen saying this. And I'll read that quote again, because this is not my objection to Jensen's work. This is Jensen identifying a shortcoming in his own work. He said, the only remaining caveat to the present results is whether the mutation rate reported in Ding et al. Represents a germline rate rather than a somatic mutation rate. So this is not my objection. This is Jensen's own concession in the paper itself.
Now, he said, if the rate I cited from Ding's data is invalid, why does it agree with the 7+ studies that have been published previously?
Rates.
And you can read his.
It agrees with the studies on mutation rates. It does
I'm
not
saying
agree
you
with
disagree with the mutation
rates. And as I explained, the substitution rates have been directly observed and measured. And it does not agree with those.
Okay, hang on. We're going to let, if you two are going to keep interrupting each other. Dan, you're on mute. SFT, make your point.
Right. So my point would just be a reiteration of the fact that the empirically observed mutation rate, which he agrees with, is faster in the mitochondrial DNA than the nuclear DNA. We can look at the Parsons paper. The empirically observed mutation rate only takes us back roughly 6,000 to 6,500 years for a most recent common ancestor, Eve date, for example. Now, the Parsons paper was so good that it was adopted by the FBI. He has a problem with that because we need to also look to substitution rates. We can't look to, per generation mutation rates because of the somatic cell line mutations. The fact is, and I'm just going to say this over and over again, you'll have to do a head-to-head prediction with Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, who has made predictions to see if this observed mutation rate is in fact accurate. And you're saying there's been predictions on lineages, when in fact I'm looking for specific predictions on people groups whose mutation rate is not yet known. That's really specific and precise. That doesn't assume the deep time evolutionary history where we need to start calibrating dates. So until I'm presented with a testable prediction on that, whether confirmed or just not confirmed yet, then that's kind of what's going to solve this problem, in my opinion. But Dan can have the last word there if you'd like.
So the first thing is, I'm not assuming anything. Do you agree with let me put it this way. Do you dispute the dates within the last 4,000 years of when various places on Earth were settled?
Well, that's the thing that Dr. Jensen's looking at in the Y chromosome.
I mean, no, I'm asking you though. Do you dispute
I'm saying there's a lot of
settled?
Yeah, I'm saying there's a lot of unknowns. Like I think a lot of dates that are set from the secularists are actually off, oftentimes by even hundreds of years. So I'd have to look at exactly the dates you're looking at.
Fine, let's cut it in half. Let's say it was 1,500 years instead of 3,000 years ago. You still end up with a date of at least 30,000 years for the mitochondrial substitution rate. Like you could be off by 50% and it still blows Jensen's numbers to bits. Like, so that's the thing is, so here's what Jensen does, right? He takes and this can be the end of this. And this was a lot of fun. And again, I want to thank all of you for letting me come on.
This has been fun.
John, thank you. So here's what Jensen does, right? He takes a pedigree study, right? Parent, offspring, counts up all the mutations that are different. Says, okay, how many per generation differences are there? And works backwards to get 6,000 years. But that's not right because most of these are never going to get passed on. What you need to do is calibrate to a known date. So you say, okay, we know when an island was settled. So we can compare that population to the sister population on the mainland nearby. We know the year, we know how many differences between them because we can count them. Then we take that long-term rate and we can apply that to other cases and see if it works. So we can look at Vanuatu and say, okay, that's 3,000 years, how many differences? Let's apply that to Europe and say, does that match the 45 or whatever thousand years we think it is? And the answer is yes. And we could apply it to Japan and say, does that match the 32,000 years? And the answer is yes. So we're making predictions specifically about how many differences we expect to see among a lineage of people following a settlement of a specific place, and the predictions hold up. And I put that link in the chat for everybody a little while ago, and there's a whole section in that paper, and I'm just going to give you the heading of the section. If you just go into that section, and I think it's called correcting or calibrating or corroborating, it's something like that, calibrating, archaeological calibration points.
Exactly. It's all based on calibration, assuming
of known
time
events.
history,
We're not
evolutionary
guessing.
substitution. My last word is going to be exactly what Dr. Nathaniel Jensen has said, because he's the one that's making the predictions. I'm just pointing out the fact that the mitochondrial DNA mutates fast, and there's very few differences that are separating any two human beings, which is indicative of a most recent common ancestor of just a few thousand years ago. So Jensen says, if my critics think that they have a better answer than what I have published, I challenge them to make scientifically testable predictions from it. For example, from my young Earth creation model, I am claiming that I can predict the mitochondrial mutation rate in the millions of species in which it has yet to be measured. This is future and novel. There's no calibration here. Like, real quick, I know you're excited. I'm almost done. He says, I'm willing to test my predictions in the lab. He's willing to do this. He says, I challenge the critics to do the same. Otherwise, by the evolutionist's own standards, their explanations regarding substitution rates, whatever, you name it, calibration with the archaeological record is just pseudoscience. So that's my last word on that one.
The paper that I linked in the chat does exactly that.
Based on calibration, though.
No. What it does is it says, here's the rate we have. If this rate is correct, we predict this degree of variation in this population. And then they go and they look and they say, given the numbers we have, do these other numbers that are new, that haven't been checked yet, do they jive with what we have? And they go through a number of cases: the colonization of Europe, the settlement of Japan, migration into the Americas, colonization of islands. They go through solid 5 or 6 cases in the paper I linked in the chat, doing exactly what you're asking for. And the answer is yes, the numbers match. And we're not basing it on assumptions. We're not basing it on evolutionary timelines. We're basing it on known, like not even archaeology. We're basing it on recorded human history of saying, this is when we arrived at this place on Earth, and then basing it on that to compare different groups. There's no assumptions in this. It's based on recorded history within the last few thousand years. I want to make that very clear to everybody. I mean, I'll just ask the panel, since there's so many people here, does anyone dispute like our knowledge of like when Madagascar or Iceland was settled by humans? Madagascar was settled 1,500 years ago. Iceland was settled 1,000 years ago. Does anyone dispute that? Like, that's a matter of recorded history. And these are the types of things we're basing these numbers on. We're not basing them on stuff, from 15 or 20 or 100,000 years ago. Anyone dispute that recorded history? It's by the way, I see your thing in the chat standing. It's just scroll up in the chat. I put the link. I'll do it again. It's in there. Here.
I didn't see it, Dan.
Oop, there you go. There it is. There it is again. I just did it. It's NCBI, blah, 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 blah. It's in there.
Is Tony the atheist here?
Yeah.
Yeah, we were supposed to have you on Smokey yesterday morning. You didn't show up, brother.
So
Yes,
can I just say, I'm going to go to bed now, but thank you for that conversation. That was a lot of fun. John, thanks for having me on, and Logical, thanks for chatting. Appreciate it.
That was very enlightening.
Okay, Dan, thanks.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually emailed Smokey. I just couldn't do it.
I have something to say. Go on, Tango. I'm sorry. I interrupted you. Go ahead, P. Tango.
It just things got crazy around my house.
Whenever you're ready to do it, because we wanted to show you some of the problems with the origin of life and how the conditions are very contrived and don't relate to the early Earth.
What I want to do is I want to actually look at my roster and we'll set up a proper time rather than just doing it off the cuff, where we just decided the day before to have a debate the next day. I don't think that's the way to do it. We should organise something that we can both lock into.
You got to email Smokey, but you do realize the origin of life is completely just a disaster.
Well, not really. What's the origin of life?
You have no examples of abiogenesis. Zero.
Well,
hey, hang on for a second, guys. Hey guys, hang on for a second. Sal had tried to come in earlier, and I wasn't able to get him in.
Sorry, Sal.
What's up, Sal? How you doing, man? I know you had something you wanted to share with us.
Now that Dan's gone and I can talk without being interrupted.
Yeah.
There is a formula that he's not accounting for. Substitution rate is not the same as mutation rate, but it depends on population size. So I don't know what his beef is. You don't calibrate substitution rates. You really don't. And I'll give you a citation. If I could put this in the I'm going to put this in the chat.
Hey, Sal, did I make you a mod, Sal? I can't remember.
Yeah, you can. I don't know.
Let me check.
So let me.
Because it won't post the link if I haven't made you a mod. Let me see.
Can I explain what I got as a layman from?
So I'm just going to challenge that, what he said, and I'm going to try to type it in, see if I can. I can't seem to.
So just make a post, or just like one letter in the chat real quick, and let me see if I can give you mod access. That may be what's going on.
Okay. Otherwise, I'll just type it in the.
No, do it in the. Are you doing it in the StreamYard chat or the YouTube chat?
I was doing it in the StreamYard chat. I went in the private chat. I can't do it in the StreamYard chat.
Sal. Sal, if you get a chance, could you give Tony the Atheist just a brief some of the problems with abiogenesis if you can?
We're trying to solve this problem right now.
Sure.
Okay, I'm just going to type this in the regular here. So first, I'm going to cite a Nature paper that shows why you don't want to calibrate substitution rates because it's dependent on population size. It's dependent on mutation rates. Substitution rates is not how you determine substitution rates. I don't know how come. That's why I was just practically flipping my lid when Dan was talking. I'm just like, this is not how it's done. So I didn't want to just let him get away scot-free.
Can I just?
I just cited this, and now I'm going to cite the relevant formula, and the relevant formula is the substitution rate is K. It depends on N, which is the population size, and mu, which is the mutation rate. And that's how you get it. You do not.
I think his point was, and like I am a layman, guys. I'm a real layman when it comes to all this stuff. But I think he was saying that if you count all the mutations in the parent and all the mutations in the child, right? You're gonna get skewed numbers because you've got to count the mutations actually get passed down. Is that basically what he was saying?
Well, there is a problem with fixation rates, and I'm sorry, I have so many windows open. I need to clean this up.
I'm just saying that like the gist I got from it, if you count all the mutations in the adult and the child, adults and children, you get skewed numbers.
Can you ask again? I'm sorry.
If you count, just from a layman's point of view, if you count all the mutations in the adult and you count all the mutations in the child, and the ones that get passed on, you get skewed numbers.
If you count all the mutations in the adult,
yeah, because some mutations
you can factor out. That's the other thing I wanted to say. You could factor out the somatic mutations, and I was about to cite that. You can then you can get
mutations get passed on, do they?
I'm sorry. Yes, that's not all mutations get passed on, and that's how you can estimate the when you factor out the somatic mutations, and there are methods to do that, and I'm about to include how that's done.
It'll probably
go
over
right
my
here.
head.
I'll show it here because he said that same thing on the internet, and I dinged him on it, and I didn't see an adequate response except that he's just complaining about the D loop. But I'm going to cite specifically something I found. First off, with a Howell study, and I'm going to see if I could find it here. I apologize. I'm trying to do a couple things at once.
Hey, Smokey.
What's up, Tony? How you doing, brother? Good to see you.
Hey, man.
So there it is. All right, so some follow-up here. This is from the Howell study. It appears that the origin, okay. All right, so I'm going to cite the Howell study, and they said it is clear that both mutations originated in the germline. And I'm just going to quote that because the chat won't let me type in the whole thing. So
when you're saying germline, you're saying that that's the mutation that gets passed from parent to child.
Right.
Yeah.
Study that. So this is the Howell study that Parsons cited. So there's a way to do it. It can be done. You can factor it out. And that's an interesting question. But my point is, and I posted something on the title on the chat. The title of the article: Substitution rates at neutral genes depend on population size. You don't calibrate mutation rates on just substitution rates. You have to factor in population size. So I don't know where that's coming from. He kept making a big deal. I'm like, well, it depends on the mutation rate. Substitution rate depends on the mutation rate. And then we can make predictions. But the most accurate way is just the way where you sequence the parents and the children. And then you can factor out, there are methods that Howell used to factor out the somatic mutations. So there are times when maybe it's not clear in a particular publication that they are able to factor it out, but it can be factored out. You can sample somatic cells and infer a germline rate. That can be done. And I cited the Howell paper. In fact, why don't I give the exact citation? And so I'll give the citation there.
Well, and I pointed out too that Parsons mutation rate is so good that it was even adopted by the FBI.
Yeah, but I don't know what this. I'm sorry, my lid was flipping when I just heard him, and I'm not really supposed to be spending so much time on these things.
So
I was just like, no, I'm just not going to let this go because he kept interrupting.
Is that what you're saying? Dan was wrong.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying, well, it's just like Brother Sal's pointing out, is you can derive, sometimes it's not easy, but you can derive an accurate germline mutation rate. But even Dr. Cardinal there was admitting that mutation rate is fast, in the mitochondrial DNA a lot faster than the nuclear DNA, and max differences between any two people are so few. So those two things considered do take us back to an Eve of just a few thousand years. Now, he's looking to substitution rates. He's saying that, see, here's the thing, and I think this is what Sal's saying, is when you take the Parsons paper or you take all the other mitochondrial DNA mutation rate sets that exist, ones that look at the D loop, right, the coding region, which is germline, and you consider heteroplasmy, somatic mutations. I mean, Dan was explaining all that. They all corroborate still on the same thing. I mean, it's like they're trying to say we can't know.
Are you saying that is he counting every mutation or just the ones that are being passed from parent to child?
We only want to count the ones that are being passed. Well, that's why multi-generational studies are the best. Then we can rule out those which are somatic and those which are germ cell.
That can be done. There are methods to do that. One way that's the way that Howell did it is he compared several somatic cells in the same individual, and if they diverged, that meant that those mutations were somatic. The ones that were consistent across generations, those were germline. It can be done. So
right, it can be.
And then the other thing is, I pointed to a paper that said we show that the substitution rate at neutral genes does depend on population size fluctuations in the presence of overlapping generations. That means substitution rates do not take priority over mutation rates. I don't know what the big deal is. You can't. That also means you can't calibrate. You can't be calibrating mutation rates based on substitution rates alone unless you know the population structure and size over time, which is really
all right. So quick interjection.
All
right, hang on, guys. So
all right.
Yes, Sal.
Sal made a great point there. Is that a paper that you put that in the chat, brother Sal? On the substitution rate?
All right.
Yes.
Hang on one second, guys. So Dr. Dan is back. We've got one more slot in the live stream. If you want to come back on, Dan, and defend your position. Go ahead, guys. You keep talking. I just want to let Dan know we got one slot left.
Yeah, I'm on my laptop now. So I gave the warning too that I was like, okay, I'm on my cell phone. You know, I don't know how much more battery life I have, but I'm here on my laptop as well. But I just point out the fact that if you do want to criticize Jensen and the work he's doing, he's taken the challenge to any evolutionist on mutation rates in not only humans but also the millions of species. The millions of species that exist, and nothing against Dan. I like Dan; he's respectful. But the second he came on, he said he read Replacing Darwin, and I asked him just to reiterate even 2 or 3 predictions out of the 10 that Jensen, went over and made in Replacing Darwin. So he didn't. He can, if he comes back in, he can.
I think we should wait till he comes back in.
Oh, it's coming. He's coming, boys. It's about to get real. Late night post. Look at what Kent Hovind and Ron Garret debate has sparked tonight. We're now having a knockdown drag out, and let's let Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal back into the action. Here we go. He's coming back in now.
I try to get out, and you pull me back in.
Dan, it's the same thing with me. You know, my phone died upstairs to watch a movie with my wife,
it's
as
fun.
I promised.
What can I say? It's fun.
I got dragged back in.
It's fun. So I came in to check. I just popped in for 30 seconds, and I heard you were still talking about it. So here I am.
No kidding.
Okay, hang on.
Content of the show.
Now, Dan, let's be honest. We know exactly. We know what really happened. You left, and then you wanted to see what the responses were going to be, and now you're just hooked, and now you're back. You just couldn't resist. It's okay, man. We get it.
I can't. I've had so much fun talking to all of you, John and Stanning and Sal. We have so much fun, and I couldn't help myself. Couldn't help myself.
Smokey, I wanted to say, hey, brother, I haven't
formally introduced myself to Smokey yet, I think, in an actual hangout. So keep up the great work, brother. You're defending the faith, and it's good to meet you officially.
Yeah, you too, Standing. Appreciate it, man. Thanks.
Dan, it's P Tango 101 here, or Tony. It was my layman's sort of sum up of what you were saying. Was that semi-accurate, or?
I missed it. I left for a few minutes, so I missed from when I left to when I just popped back in the chat. I missed everything. So I apologize. I don't have an answer.
Well, then I think that we need
like
to
way above my pay grade. Okay.
Then I think that Sal needs to make the point that he was making.
Okay.
About the mutation versus substitution rate.
First thing, substitution rates are affected by population structure, size. If they're neutral, it used to be the classical theory that that was independent, but that's now into question. Not to mention substitution rates are affected by selection, either positive or negative. So it's not really the greatest way to be estimating mutation rates. I don't know why we would want to be using substitution rates as any measure of how much a mutation rate is. Furthermore, there are methods to filter out, at least hypothetically, and there has been historical claims that they could tease apart somatic mutations from germline mutations. That was all the way back in the Howell paper that Parsons studied. So I'm not saying that Nathaniel Jensen is necessarily right, but this can surely be kind of cleaned out. What I'm objecting to is this use of substitution rates.
It's coming, Bill.
I mean, how can, unless you know what the selection factors are, the selection coefficients were on those positions, and if you don't know the population size, how is that good for anything that we're talking about relative to doing real, tracking intergenerational changes?
Yeah, you're right about most of that. Yeah, absolutely. And that's why you get such a big range for what the actual time to most recent common ancestor is, ranging from 60,000 years to about 200,000 years. The differences in those estimates are based on what's the population size, what's the population structure? Is it growing? Is it constant? Is it constantly fluctuating?
Those are substitution rates. Those are not mutation rates.
But okay, Sal. But do you? So hang on. Let me show you. So this is what I had popped up before. Was this representation showing parent, offspring, and then you've got somatic and germline mutations in here. And when you're trying to figure out how long in the past a most recent common ancestor existed, all that matters are the somatic mutations. The germline mutations. The somatic ones don't matter, right? So if you're doing a pedigree one and you're measuring the mutation rate, that is useful information. And I want to make very clear, mutation rates are useful information to have, but they are not informative for time to most recent common ancestor calculations, because putting aside all the stuff about selection,
it doesn't fit the deep time evolutionary story. That's why.
Well, I've corrected you on that a couple times now, because I don't think we disagree about when like islands were settled in the last couple thousand years. I don't think we disagree about that.
No, because I think that again is relying on non-empirical evidence, inference, and I know you just sent me that. I'll look it over and also
recorded history, though. I mean, do you disagree about when Madagascar and Iceland were settled? That's recorded history. That's not inferred.
What's not recorded is the population structure.
But that's irrelevant to somatic versus germline.
Nor is the selection. You need the selection coefficients to be able to make some determination.
To make a specific determination,
you don't have substitution. Your substitution rates are not constant if you're invoking selection. It could be either negative or positive. You can't deny that. So unless you have that data, you're saying it's recorded history, it's not sufficiently recorded to make that much of an inference. I'm not saying that Nathaniel Jensen's right, but I'm just protesting that this whole thing about substitution rates and calibration is probably a very poor measurement. The best measurement
and that's why the evolutionary dates range from 60,000, 70,000, 200,000, because there's so many factors at play. And like Brother Sal said, is Dr. Nathaniel Jensen absolutely correct? Well, we'll see. He's made future testable predictions. No, He's making future testable predictions on people groups. We don't even know their mutation rates yet. And you're admitting that evolutionary community has not made those predictions. You're pointing to a paper regarding substitution rate and inferences made regarding population.
I want to be very clear here.
That's
I
not
want to be really clear about this, though. For this question, the question of when in the past did the most recent common ancestor for a part of the genome exist? For that question, mutation rates, per generation mutation rates, are not relevant. What is relevant is long-term substitution. No, they're not.
They are relevant. Yes, they are.
We're talking about per generation mutation rates.
That's the empirical method. It's not relevant because it doesn't fit your story.
Well, look, Standing, listen, look. Do you agree that these somatic mutations right here, they're not getting passed on to the offspring, and that these somatic mutations right here were never present in the parent? I think we should all be able to agree on that, right? Can we all agree on that? Yeah, right? Okay. Yes. So if you base your per generation rate on mutations that are not passed on from generation to generation, do you see the problem with that, using that number to go back more than
Nobody's doing that.
That's what Jensen does. That's what Jensen does.
No, he looks at triads, dyads, the multi-generational. Yes, he does.
Did he do that? Where? Because in the 2015 paper, he said he hasn't done that.
Dan, give me 3 predictions that he's made in replacing Darwin.
That is a different question.
This time. Okay, name one prediction.
He predicted the rate of bird speciation.
The rate of bird speciation. Correctly.
He predicted the rate of mitochondrial mutations in African populations. Like, he made predictions, but that's not relevant to this question, which is
yes, it is, because he's saying that the mutation rate he is using, mutation rate he is using, is 100% germline. So he's not
making that prediction.
I don't
want
to talk over each other the whole time. I've read through his book 3-4 times. I've read through his technical papers. I talk to him frequently. Yes, he's considered all these studies. He's confident that they are germ cell line mutations. He's considered what you're saying on all of these studies. For example, the D-loop region, which is definitely germline. It's a coding region.
And the DING study? No, it's not.
The DING study.
It's not germline.
Corroborated by
he says it.
7 other studies where the empirical mutation rate.
It corroborates the mutation rate, but it's not germline.
We're just going in circles. Yeah.
I'm not articulating something new.
There's a way, like Brother Sal was saying, there is a way to figure out if it's germline or if it's somatic.
Yeah, guys, guys, I'm not articulating something new. I'm repeating what Jensen said in his 2015 publication from AIG, where he said the whole mitochondrial genome confirms the D-loop mutation rates. In that thing, and I read it twice earlier, he said that these data do not permit us to distinguish between germline and somatic mutations. So you need to do a study of 3 generations or more to confirm the germline rate. Now, my question is, has he done
triads and dyads? Yes,
so has he done that?
Yes, he's looked at triads and dyads.
Do you have the paper, the reference for that?
Yes.
Can you send it to me via email? That would be awesome.
I will.
Because I have read, I believe, everything Jensen's written on this topic, and I am not familiar with a study that he has done that uses 3 generations. Because when you use 3 generations, you get a different number. When you use more than 2 generations, you get a different number necessarily. And that's not biology, it's just math because of the somatic versus germline problem.
Right. Did something happen to the stream? I only see
jungle jargon right now, but that's cool. Whatever. That's my point. It's a somatic versus germline. All that stuff that Sal said is right. That is correct, that there is an open question about human population structure historically. There's an open question about selection. There's an open question about lots of different factors in here.
Right.
But what there is not an open question about is whether somatic mutations are transmitted to offspring. And the answer is no. But the data that Jensen used to arrive at the 6,000 year figure assumes the answer is yes. And that's why he's wrong. And it's not more complicated than that.
So if you look at his endnote section in Replacing Darwin, and I don't want to just spend an entire night trying to defend his work, and he can defend it himself. But if you look at his endnotes in Replacing Darwin, he cites numerous other studies that all corroborate on the same
same mutation rate.
On the same mutation, yes.
Right.
Mutation rate and substitution rate is different. I understand that.
Is a different
mutation rate, the empirical.
Sal, you missed it a minute ago, but I agreed with you. I said almost everything you said was right, just so you know.
Oh, thank you.
No, it's the standing. I totally agree with you that the mutation rate, that it's a little bit weird how he derives mutation rate, because the correct way to do it is to do it's per site, per replication, not per generation. But it's you can translate back and forth with reasonable assumptions about generation times, and I don't have a problem with that. And you could point to a bunch of other mutation rate studies that corroborate Jensen's numbers, but that doesn't get around the problem of the fact that a mutation rate, like by definition, includes somatic mutations, and those do not persist over generations because they're somatic, and we should be able to agree on that.
What if we know that they're germ? Then
they're not somatic, and Jensen says we can't distinguish. He says that
he's confident that he has distinguished.
He's confident,
and that's why he's made. Because, for example, if you're familiar with his book, he points out that that the fruit fly, I think it was the fruit fly, the roundworm, the water flea, and the yeast mitochondrial mutation rate studies. Those studies were measured in mutation accumulation lines, and that means they were measured over several generations of. That's right. And by definition, well, you would agree, obviously, because we've been talking about that those studies would measure germline mutations and not somatic mutations. So he asked the question, why do all of those studies agree so strongly then? We know those are germline, and they all agree on a young Earth creation time scale. But then you have this.
No, they don't.
Oh, yeah. He goes over it in great detail.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong, but yeast is yeast unicellular or multicellular? That matters. Yeast don't have germline. Yeast are unicellular. So you can, every mutation is a germline mutation in yeast. So, okay, sure. And if you have species like flies or something, they're smaller. They have fewer cells. So a higher proportion of their mutations are germline.
Right, but
so the specific parameters matter for this stuff.
I'm just waiting for you to get to your point, because they all agree, though.
They agree on the mutation rate, yes.
But then
they agree on the mutation rate. Yep. They agree on the mutation rate, which is not appropriate for measuring over many generations. And okay, so we're not going to agree on this, so I think we should move on to the other question, which is the human substitution rate and whether those calculations are valid. Because I really want to know if anybody here disputes the historical record of when humans settled Madagascar or Iceland or Vanuatu or the Canary Islands. Because those are things that happened in recorded human history. Does anyone dispute when those things happened?
I think more or less they're probably.
Okay.
As I pointed out earlier, there's work being done by Dr. Jensen himself in the Y chromosome where he's showing that there are inconsistencies.
Has he taken up archaeology
in those dates?
Has Jensen taken up archaeology now in Pacific Islands?
Right. So he's looking at some of these dates from archaeology. Some of these dates derive regarding the history of civilization, and he's discovering.
It's not the history of civilization.
He's looking at genetics and population histories and population sizes, for example. I'm just saying that
doesn't matter. Population size doesn't matter for what I'm talking about.
Is my point. But
population size doesn't matter. It's just when did populations diverge is all that matters. It's the only relevant measure here is when did populations diverge? And we can use these things based on direct measurements from recorded history. Because as you said, as we all agree on, the mitochondria mutate really fast, which makes it useful even in the short term. So you can look at things from 1,000, 2,000 years ago, and you could actually have enough differences to actually be usable. So we can look at things like islands that were settled 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And that's within recorded human history, and it sets a date of this is the maximum date for when all of these mutations accumulated, all of these substitutions occurred. And then we can use those observed differences.
But don't you have to refer to population sizes? Or
no, you don't. It doesn't matter. The population size doesn't matter. All that matters is the date of divergence, because all we care about is the per generation number, right? So if you have really it's the per year number.
I think there's some inferences, though. No, I don't.
Nope. It's so we settled Vanuatu from Papua New Guinea about 3,000 years ago. I think it was about 3,000 years ago.
Okay, but so you're looking at these.
So you compare the differences between those two populations, and you can see in those 3,000 years how many differences accumulated, and that gives you the long-term substitution rate.
So you're saying by looking at that and calibrating it, the mutation rate is then a lot slower than it is now from when you do studies.
Exactly, because when you do it that way, when you do it correctly based on those known divergence dates, what you're doing is you're excluding all of these somatic mutations. You're getting rid of those, and you're just doing the germline ones. That allows you, that gives you a number, and then you can use that number to predict other things. So we can say, okay, given that number that we know is valid from Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, we can then say, well, archaeologically, we know Europe was settled 45,000 years ago. We expect X number of differences between European populations and, say, Iranian populations. Let's test that prediction. We know Japan was settled 32,000 years ago archaeologically, so we can predict X number of differences between Japanese populations and Korean populations. Let's see if that prediction is validated. And what turns out, and this is that paper I sent you via email, and I think someone put it in the chat on my behalf, because only mods can put links in the chat, so thank you to whoever did that. Those predictions are validated. They work. So, like, those are the validated predictions that you're asking for. This is not using
because if you're saying that, if you're saying based on this calibration, that mutation rates were indeed a lot slower in
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that.
Well, of course you are, because
I'm not. I'm saying substitution rates are necessarily slower than mutation rates, not that mutation rates were slower in the past. Those are two different things.
So you're saying mutation. So you're okay with a fast mutation rate system throughout history? Mm-hmm. It's just the substitution rates that you have the issue, which is not the same as mutation rate. Right. So, like I said, it comes down to testable predictions. I've said that multiple times.
And I've told you we've got them in that paper I sent you.
And you pointed me to a paper that if I haven't read it yet, then how can I comment on whether or not it's...
I mean, you haven't read it. Apparently Jensen hasn't read it yet either. Because it was written in 2009.
Well, I suspect Jensen probably has. That's why I'm going to...
He didn't mention it in his book.
Since it's a head-to-head prediction, which is I'm saying that's the deciding factor. Jensen's got his own predictions showing that, hey, listen, I'm confident with this empirically observed mutation rate and the mutation rate I'm using, for example, the one in the Parsons paper, that I'm going to make testable predictions on the history of civilization and also on people groups, like you said. So I appreciate you answered that. Voice on peoples. Well, no, you guys haven't actually made predictions like pointed to a people group. Let's say the Khoisan. We don't know how fast their mutation rate changes.
I mean, does Japanese not count? Does Pacific Islander not count? Like, these are specific lineages that were making specific predictions about the number of differences in their mitochondrial genome. These are specific predictions based on a directly measured substitution rate, and those predictions have been validated.
Actually, that's an interesting point you make. So if you're okay with the mutation rate being fast in the mitochondrial DNA...
Wait a minute. Don't change the topic. Do you disagree with the thing I just said or not?
It's hard to comment until I've actually looked at that paper to see...
All right, well, maybe when we have our talk, we can talk about that paper specifically.
Let's do it. That's good.
It's relevant to the topic. All right, so next thing, yeah.
Well, just a quick question, because I find that interesting that if you accept that the mutation rate is fast in the mitochondrial DNA, would you be confident then to look at, let's say the same prediction Dr. Jensen looked at in the Khoisan peoples, would you be confident then to actually predict how fast their mutation rate would change per generation?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Would you make the same prediction that he's made then?
No, so correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding from reading Jensen is that he's predicting that in certain African populations, you expect to see a higher mitochondrial mutation rate. Do I have that correct? A higher per generation rate.
It's more or less correct. He's saying that it could be though because of generation times. So the DNA differences and the faster mutation.
Well, that's why we use per year, right? That's why we typically use per year rather than per generation.
Right.
So, I mean, that's the thing, though, because if you have faster generation times, then year over year it can be the same. But if you have a faster per generation rate, then that's going to make it look like it's faster. So that's, you have to be very precise about what we're predicting here. Is he predicting faster per generation or per year? And my understanding from reading it is that he's predicting faster per year, and he may explain that via shorter generation times, I think is what he's saying.
I don't want to put words in his mouth. So his exact prediction on paper is no direct measurement of the mitochondrial DNA mutation rate has been performed in the most divergent African people groups. I expect that the rate in these groups will be on the order of 1 mutation per 5 to 8 generations or faster. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if these divergent African lineages mutate twice as fast as the non-African lineages, 1 mutation per 2.5 to 4 generations. And then there's a whole other page of other predictions, which I'm not going to bore the audience with.
I think that prediction is wrong. I will say I think that prediction is wrong. Okay. I don't think we have any good reason to suspect that within humans there's variation in mitochondrial mutation rates. I don't think that's a reasonable prediction. I think the average mitochondrial mutation rate is going to be pretty darn consistent across human lineages. I think what Jensen is getting at is that within African populations, you have higher diversity than non-African populations because humanity started in Africa. So you've had a number of founder events. So you've reduced the genetic diversity outside of Africa several times, like iteratively. As we've migrated away from like present day Ethiopia, basically. And so I think what he's doing is looking at that higher level of diversity and saying that implies a higher mutation rate. And I don't think that is correct.
Right. So, and that's what's interesting about scientific predictions, because if you say that it's going to come back,
we can look.
Right. And you're right. So if that did come back accurate, then that would reflect the young Earth creation explanation for
because again, that's mutation, not substitution rate. That's a different thing. And he specifically says he actually hedges on this.
We're just talking about the higher mutation rate in the African people groups, because the evolutionist story based on the out of Africa scenario, that would explain the higher diversity in African people groups. But our explanation would be based on possibly a faster mutation rate or shorter generation times, faster generation times. Right. So that's why he's making that prediction. And we don't know if it's true or not yet, and that's what's fun about.
Well, so he can be right though. He can be right though, and I can agree with him, because if he's saying the substitution rate, I want to be clear, we're talking per generation, per year long-term substitution rate. He can say we expect the African substitution rate to be faster due to shorter generation time. I would not disagree with that, because shorter generation time will lead to, because again, what you're doing here, right, we care about the time interval. So what we're doing here is we're just squeezing more of these arrows into the same amount of time, right? So like he can be totally right about that, but he kind of hedges a little bit, and it's ambiguous in the book whether he's talking about mutation rates, which I think are going to be constant, and substitution rates, which I think, given what he talks about with generation times, it's reasonable to think they may be faster. That's not in conflict with anything that I've said. I would like for him to be very clear, though, because from reading his book, and I mean, I got my iPad right here, and I could show you the pages and pages of highlighting and notes that I've done on this book. It's a little ambiguous about what specifically he's talking about. But I don't necessarily disagree with his prediction, depending on specifically what he means. It's just ambiguous what he specifically means.
Gentlemen, can I interject one quick question? There was kind of a dynamic of this conversation. I was waiting to see if it came up, and I don't know if it has, or maybe I didn't catch it. Can I just throw something out there real fast?
Of course, buddy.
Does it matter at all if perchance at certain points in time, we're kind of using all these calculations of generations, it seems, to get timelines of people settling and thing like that. There could have been periods of time where generations people were breeding very, very quickly, and other times where they were breeding very slow. Is any of this kind of considered in these factors at all?
Not in substitution rates, because they're very specifically calculated in terms of changes per site per year. To get around the generation time problem. And that allows you to do apples to apples comparisons between species with different generation times. So you can compare different viruses, you can compare humans to mice, you can compare humans to viruses. By doing it per year, you get around the generation time problem.
Okay, that's kind of
otherwise it becomes apples and oranges, and you can't do a good comparison. But
yeah, that's kind of where I was. Yeah. Well, that's what I was thinking about, because there's certainly bottlenecks in human history where we lived very short periods of time, bred very rapidly, died a whole bunch, and would have therefore. Right, that's kind of okay. So I just
and that's in the biblical model and in the regular model.
That's
right?
why I wanted to
bottlenecks. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's
all right.
That's point too, because there could be, and it seems there is, hypermutating lineages due to inbreeding and bottlenecks, if you will. For example, the Neanderthals. I mean, this is a prediction that Dr. Jensen has made, but it's also it's also iterated in the work of Dr. John Sanford too, who you love so much, Dan. Contested bones, that these DNA differences are the result, and actually these anomalous features and atypical features found in, well, actually not only the Neanderthals, but Homo naledi, the hobbits, right, Homo floresiensis, for example, that these were the result of hypermutating lineages due to inbreeding, right? These mutations come to the forefront, and so those lineages.
We should distinguish though. With the problem with inbreeding isn't that you accelerate the mutation rate, it's that you end up getting a lot of homozygosity. So you lose diversity over generations. You have a lot of accumulation, but not necessarily a faster rate. That's a quibble, but I just want to be clear about that.
Especially those recessive mutations that have accumulated for generations and generations. Now, boom, they're coming to the forefront, because I always say inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir, if you will, of genetic mistakes. So yeah, if there's a lot of inbreeding going on, and especially if it's going on for a long time, that population stays small for a long time, then more mutations can become even fixated.
Yeah, you can fix more over a long period. Although I do want to be clear, because this is an error Jensen makes, is that he implies that the size of a bottleneck doesn't matter, that it's the duration of a bottleneck. And I want to be very clear, that's just straight up wrong. What matters in a bottleneck is the minimum effective population size. It could be one generation, it can be 1,000. But what matters is it's a thing called the effective population size. Now, typically, if you have a longer bottleneck, that will result in a smaller effective population size. But when you can look at a one generation bottleneck, and Jensen goes into this in his book in some detail about how, well, if you shrink and then you grow exponentially right out of the bottleneck, you don't lose that much genetic diversity. And he does a clever bait and switch talking about combinations rather than permutations. And he uses the math words in place of the biology words. What he's talking about is recombination versus heterozygosity. And what he ignores is that through a bottleneck, you necessarily lose heterozygosity. So at a certain locus in the genome, you lose all the biodiversity above and beyond whatever your minimum effective population size is. So there's a little weirdness going on in the way Jensen talks about that, and we should be aware of that.
Especially in a bottleneck, let's say it's somewhere between 2 and 10,000. If that bottleneck, if that effective population size stays between 2 and 10,000 for say 1,000 generations, well, you're going to have, you said, you will have rapid shifts.
I agree. But Jensen doesn't propose a bottleneck of between 2 and 10,000. He proposes a bottleneck of 12, 8. What would it have been? I guess it would have been 6, right?
Well, at the time of the flood,
bottleneck of 6.
At the time of the but it also comes down to the competing explanations of the origin of genetic.
Well, I'm going by your explanation.
Well, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, my explanation as well is that the majority of nuclear DNA differences are the result of created heterozygosity. So by the time of the flood, how many of genetic mistakes have accumulated in order to come to the forefront and then come to fixation and then
that doesn't matter. But the question is, how many get through the flood? So if you have 12 individuals and 3 of them are siblings, which I think I have that right.
You'd have Noah, his wife, 3 sons, and
you've got the 3 wives, and we don't know their ancestry, but then you've got the 3 sons that are siblings, right?
6 reproducing couples.
So so you've got a maximum for the 3 sons, you've got a maximum of 4 alleles, right? 2 from Noah, 2 from Noah's wife. And then for the 3 others, you've got a maximum of 6 alleles, 2 each, because we're diploid, so we have 2 of each locus, and so each person has 2. So if you assume every allele in that population is different, you've got 2, 4, 6 in the wives, plus Noah and Noah's wife in the sons. So you've got a maximum of 10 alleles in that population. Are there any human loci that have more than 10 alleles right now?
No, but genetically,
yes, there are. There are a lot that have more than 10.
But
so where did all that new variation come from? It wasn't created.
No, right. No, I agree with that. But I mean, a lot of those alleles, so you'd have that created genetic heterozygosity. You could still get mutations.
Yeah, exactly.
Since the flood to account for the extra allele. That's what I meant.
Yeah, you can, right. But, so you generate it later. But I thought in the creation you couldn't generate a whole bunch of new stuff. I thought that was the point. It's all loss.
No, you can generate through mutations. I mean, the source of all variation, according to the evolution model, would be mutations over time.
So we can generate. Well, I'm not talking about the evolution model, though. I'm talking about the creation model. So
even the creation model could essentially generate some new variation since the time of the flood. Of course.
Okay, great, cool.
I have a question for Dan. Can I ask a question?
Please do. I should go to bed soon, but this is way too much fun.
Yeah. I always think that scientists such as yourself would do better if they would study history first, or at least go back and study history, especially when they're doing genetics and genetic studies, and try to match it up with history. What would you say to that?
I think that's absolutely right. Like, history is super critical, and everyone should study history. I love history. I was almost a history major in college. Like, everybody should study history. It's super important. Yeah. By the way, it's where I am. It's 12:25 right now, and I'm gonna set a time for myself for 12:35. So I'm saying that now. No matter what we're talking about, I gotta go to bed. So like I'm saying that right now, so no one can accuse me of cutting and running based on what we're talking about. So in 10 minutes, I got to run. So I'm just going to say that right now. But yeah, I think history is
question. I have a follow-up question. Is that do you know that the genealogies, they all go? You know how they go out, they spread out, and then they go back in, and they converge back at a smaller population. You know that, like, all the history goes back to Sumerians or Africans or Europeans, right?
I mean, if you go back far enough, it's all African, but yeah.
Yeah, well, the African Y chromosome is A, B, and E, and the C went east instead of west, and the D also went east instead of west. They never even went to Africa.
I don't think that's a correct interpretation of those data, because the presence of a lineage in someplace other than Africa doesn't mean the ancestral lineage was never there. It just means that that specific lineage didn't arise until after it left, and like that's a common thing. So
and
like
I can explain the CY chromosome too, because it's in the area where the son of Cush, Nimrod, had a kingdom early on in the land of Shinar, which is Mesopotamia, and so he never even went back to Africa, and his descendants went east to Mongolia and eventually all the way to America, all over the Pacific and everywhere else, but they never even went to Africa.
Okay, so I should tell you I'm not in any way like a biblical scholar. I know the basics of the timelines and things, but like I don't know the intricacies of how it supposedly matches up with modern genetics. But it's totally possible to have an ancestral population that has one set of, alleles, right? And then as there are migrations away from that, those lineages through mutation develop new alleles. That's perfect. We know that happens.
Because they do belong to the family tree of the E's, which are the Cushites. Of course, there's 3 E's in Africa. There's the Cushites, the Mitzrayim, and the Phoenicians from Put. Those are the 3 sons of Ham,
so
plus the Canaan. Plus the Canaanites were in Canaan. But
I will take your word for it, because again, I'm not super familiar with how the Y chromosome phylogenies match up with the biblical timeline. Like I don't know how to correlate the Y chromosome lineages to the specific lineage, the biblical lineages.
Yeah, I'm almost positive.
I don't know how those two things correlate. Like I don't know how they work.
I'm almost positive that the CY chromosome is from Nimrod because he had the kingdom very early on. He's the son of Cush, and I don't think he ever even went to Africa when they broke apart, when they started spreading out. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I couldn't tell you one way or the other, but I do know that the Y chromosome, using the same techniques that we've talked about, the Y chromosome, most recent common ancestor, is older than the mitochondrial one. Mitochondria, depending on your population and selection model, is 60 to 200,000 years ago, and the Y chromosome is 2 to 300,000 years ago. So the Y chromosome is the most recent common ancestor was in the more distant past. But I don't know how the specific lineages have been correlated with like biblical lineages.
I thought it was the opposite. I thought the mtDNA with the Neanderthals went back farther back into history.
Well, once you include Neanderthals, that's true, because Neanderthals diverged from Homo heidelbergensis, and heidelbergensis originated in Africa but left about 600,000 years ago. So the most recent common ancestor with human and Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA would be much, much older. That would be at least 600,000 years ago.
Okay, the thing that I wonder about is that the Africans don't have the Neanderthal DNA. It's the Europeans that have it.
Right, because Neanderthals evolved a bunch of alleles after heidelbergensis left Africa. So you have the Neanderthals in Central Africa and Europe, and you've got the Denisovans in East and Southeast Asia that interbred with Homo sapiens populations after we left Africa. So you had the injection of non-Homo sapien genetic markers into various Homo sapien populations post out of Africa migration. So you have the Neanderthal markers and the Denisovan markers in populations other than African populations.
Except that we're so similar to the Africans, though. It's not like, I mean, the Neanderthals.
Teensy.
Yeah, the Neanderthals have seem to have more differences than we have from Africans.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because the most recent common ancestor between African and non-African human populations is like 60 to 80,000 years ago. But the most recent common ancestor between any human and Neanderthals is like 600,000 years ago, at least. So there's going to be more differences just based on the big difference in time to most recent common ancestor. So that explains, it's just the longer the time to most recent common ancestor, the more differences there are. And actually, I'll give you a really good example of this that is counterintuitive at first, and this will be the last thing, and then I'll leave everyone to talk about other stuff.
What was confusing to me is that the Neanderthals are supposed to have evolved from the Africans, and if that's the case,
Neanderthals evolved from non-African populations.
Well, I mean, yeah, but the non-Africans came from the Africans. I mean, so I think it matches more the biblical evidence that it's from before the flood or people that never made it through the flood.
Okay, so here's a really simple illustration for this. So we've got sharks, goldfish, and people, right? And I should say, this is the present down here. PR is present, and PA is the past. Okay, so real basic here. So you've got the past up here with each branch point. That's a node. That's that's a common ancestor. And then down here you've got the present, where you've got people, goldfish, and sharks. And I hope that's clear that that's a shark, a goldfish, and a person. So if you look at this tree, right, if you think just like morphologically, what's more related? The obvious answer is goldfish and shark are more related to each other than either of them are to people. But genetically and evolutionarily, people and goldfish are more closely related than either of them are to the shark, because they share a more recent common ancestor.
Well, a shark is very different from a fish, though.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but to bring this back to what we're talking about here, we've got different human populations, and then we've got Neanderthals over here. So the Neanderthal most recent common ancestor with any Homo sapien population is way in the past compared to the common ancestor of any two humans. So you're going to have way more differences there over time.
So then the Africans accompanied the rest of us.
I mean, there are obviously still African populations.
Which doesn't really make sense to me.
And that's where there's more genetic diversity. Like most of human genetic diversity is found within African populations relative to non-African populations, because we've been in Africa longer, in the span of 200 to 300,000 years, but we only left Africa 60, maybe on the outside 80,000 years ago. So you get just a ton more genetic diversity in Africa compared to outside of it. But I should be very clear, though, the degree of differences between any two humans, the most divergent humans you can find, is smaller than the degree of difference you could find in like gorilla populations that live a couple miles apart on the opposite side of like a mountain range or a river in Central Africa, because those two gorilla populations have been apart for longer than any two humans on Earth, because humans are like, we just arrived on the scene in evolutionary time.
Dan, real quick question before I get it. I think me and you are going to get it.
Yeah, we got to go to bed. This is not good.
Are you familiar with, like, what are your thoughts on it's kind of a recent paper on the Neanderthals, on how they were highly inbred. They were 40% less fit than modern humans, suggesting that the inbreeding and the results from inbreeding, like the degeneration, for example, the mutations coming to the forefront, for example, and obviously shifts from heterozygosity to homozygosity, explaining the DNA diversity of Neanderthals as compared to what you're saying, that the more DNA differences would reflect a greater common ancestor in the past, divergence times.
Well,
so you see that paper, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's two different things. So that kind of thing is looking at differences among Neanderthals. And we've now isolated a number of full Neanderthal genomes, not just mitochondrial, but like nuclear genomes, full genomes. And this is why, like, if you do 23andMe and stuff, you can get like your percentage Neanderthal DNA now. So we've like got genomes for them. And if you look at the Neanderthal genome, it's inbred. Now, there's probably some sampling bias in there because we just don't have that much of them relative to like how many human genomes we have. But it's very likely that as they approached extinction, they went into what's called an extinction vortex, which inbreeding is a part of that. But that's a different question from their divergence from Homo sapiens, right? So they can be inbred within their lineage. So like
I'm just saying that
if we treat the sharks as the Neanderthals, they can be inbred within that lineage, but you could still have a lot of differences compared to any two humans.
Well, more mutations would accumulate essentially in a small inbred population, such as what seems to be the case with the Neanderthals. So I'm just pointing out that is it the case of divergence time and universal common ancestry, or is it a case of just inbreeding and rapid genetic degeneration, as Dr. Sanford would suggest in Contested Bones? I think that those are both decent hypotheses to consider. You know, that's what the evidence seems to
suggest. It is divergence, and the reason we know that, and this will be the last thing, and then I got to go, so everyone can feel free to refute me at will. But it's divergence, and the reason we know that is there are markers of when you have like long-term mutations accumulating versus the short-term phenomenon of an extinction vortex, which it's true that mutations accumulate, but on net, an extinction vortex reflects a loss of genetic diversity because you're going from heterozygosity to homozygosity.
Right.
And so on net, the problem isn't the number of mutations in an extinction vortex, is that you can't select against them because the population is very small. So it's inbred and you have a lot of genetic drift. So they're kind of like genetic entropy as Sanford envisions it, and an extinction vortex are kind of opposite phenomena genetically. Genetic entropy or error catastrophe is lots of mutations and therefore lots of heterozygosity. And an extinction vortex is loss of heterozygosity, so you get more uniform over time. So we can actually tell, we can detect that. And with that, I'm going to go to bed, everybody. So thanks for inviting me back in after I mistakenly, I should not have popped back in, but what the heck, that was fun. So
thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Dan. It's been fun. I'm calling it a night too.
Yeah, happy to talk to you all. Have a good night.
Good chat. Good after show, guys.
Hey, SFT, are you still there?
Yes, brother Sal.
No, I wanted Dan to have his time. I mean, I didn't, because either of us could talk really, really long, and I don't have to turn in quite as early as he does. I was looking at while he was talking, I was looking at the Ding paper that Nathaniel Jensen cited, and they can estimate. They're estimating the number of mutations that happen in the mitochondrial DNA. It increases with age. So they're clearly able to distinguish the age-related, which means more somatic mutations from the germline. So the only question is how accurately can we model the germline mutation rate? But it's not like we're just. I don't expect the reason I don't expect Dr. Jensen to be just randomly grabbing a somatic mutation rate and applying it to a germline rate.
Right.
Is because I look at papers like this, and when I had dinner with him at ICC 2018, he was describing how all this plays out. First off, a cell can actually have up to 10,000 mitochondrial DNAs. So a single cell has only one nuclear DNA in general, but it could have up anywhere from 100 to 10,000 mitochondrial DNAs because it could have that many mitochondrial organelles in it. And so what they can do is they can sequence a particular cell at someone's, depending on their age, they can determine how much change has happened. They've been able to estimate how much the influence of age has happened. So they know then some idea of how many somatic mutations are induced in the somatic germline. I mean, this is it's not in a vacuum that this is computed. So
what are you guys inferring?
It's not, by the way, this is not trivial stuff. So I'm sorry, I interrupted someone.
No, it's not trivial. And what Sal is saying is actually really, really important details. And like you said, Brother Sal, it's not in a vacuum. It's not like you said, you had dinner with Dr. Jensen. He's not just pulling this out of nowhere and, paying no attention to detail. You're reading the Ding paper, as we were speaking, as Dan was speaking, and it is reasonable to infer into.
Yeah, and I mean, there's just some mathematics to this. Is that once the somatic, this is really kind of subtle, but once the somatic line starts to progress further, it's not like the nuclear DNA. In the nuclear DNA, the descendants in the somatic line can keep accumulating. It's not quite so simple with mitochondrial DNA, right, where you have 10,000. When you have up to 10,000 different mitochondria, it's a different set of math. It's not quite that simple. And that I specifically asked Dr. Jensen, "What about this?" He said, "Well, in the embryo, there might only be 9 mitochondrial DNA per cell." And I said, "How'd they figure that out?" They said they worked it out by inference. And by the time you have full-fledged somatic cells in an adult, some of those cells could have 10,000 mitochondria. And one thing in Ding's paper, it was saying that there's only one. They could only find approximately one mutation that was over 4% representation. I would take that to mean even if you're having some somatic mutations, it's only a small percent.
Good point.
It's only a small percent.
Okay.
If you're really one mitochondrial DNA.
So even granting them some somatic cell line mutations, it's still pretty insignificant then, more or less. If if it is significant, it's in a way that can be accounted for. Yes.
And Ding's paper said it's approximately one mutation. Okay. You could just. So,
which isn't going to change things extraordinarily, is the point.
I don't know. Let me just say this. I wouldn't be too quick to say Nathaniel Jensen's wrong. That's my point. I'm not. What I was trying to argue is, Dan, Dan's the one who's being too quick to just write him off.
Right. Yeah.
That's what I was having issue with. I said
You got
that's what I really. He was invoking substitution rates, and he said, "Sal, you're absolutely right." And I wanted to say, I should have said, "Thank you very much." I said, what he said is, well, then, that's why we have such big divergence, big dates and big variation in dating things.
Huge variation.
I said, that could be true for just about everything in evolutionary biology. I mean, do you really want to go there? Because then we could throw out a lot of other supposed, ideas. So I don't know that he wants to go there.
You gotta speak up, Pete Tango.
So
try to speak louder.
What you're inferring, basically, what you're inferring is all these mutations happened over 6 to 10,000 years.
Well, that's the point is in the mitochondrial DNA, and Dan agreed with me on these two things, that the mitochondrial DNA mutates fast, and there's only very few differences that actually separate any two human beings from the mitochondrial Eve sequence. So yeah, they can easily be accounted for in 6,000 years, but now Dan wants to look to, of course, the substitution rates, and well, we don't want to rehash everything, but he does agree. Yeah, there's only very few.
I thought Nathaniel was being cautious. He said we don't know that
cool.
absolutely.
No, I can dig it. We heard him. We heard him talk. So how does that agree with, say, radioactive decay? Like I'm talking about, like you're saying that everything happened within a very short amount of time. There's a bunch of things on the other side of that equal sign.
Yeah. The problem that I have, and the first problem is it is a known problem. I'm going to answer your question kind of indirectly. One, we don't know all the mechanics of radioactive decay, despite claims to the contrary, and that's when I was in graduate school, I studied physics, and one of the reasons I studied physics was to look at the radioactive decay and what they also call nucleosynthesis, and it's not as clear cut as it's represented in the textbooks. So,
can we measure radioactive decay?
Yes, under given conditions, but we can also change the speed. We can also change the speed of radioactive decay.
What happens if you change the speed of radioactive decay?
You can make it decay faster, and then you can also change the composition.
Like there's an energy, isn't there, that comes from radioactive decay?
Yes. So you're probably alluding to the incineration problem. But this also relates to the nucleosynthesis problem, because if the Earth was created without radioactivity and it arrived in connection with the flood, that changes everything on so many scales. And there's evidence
that's a little bit like special pleading, Sal. That's a little bit like special pleading.
Oh, and that may be fine, that you may feel that way and you're not convinced. But I'm rather convinced that the issue's not settled, because why is it that why is there 70 times more uranium on the continents than there is on the seafloor? That doesn't make sense from a nucleosynthesis standpoint, that we came from a supernova. That totally doesn't make sense.
I'm just talking about heat
That's
and
not
radiation.
A special pleading. That's a serious anomaly.
No, I'm just talking about heat and radiation. I'm just talking about heat and radiation.
Okay.
Yeah. What happens with those products when you jam that up to 11?
Yeah. You would get increased heat.
Yeah. And radiation.
Tony, we're going to have that discussion. I know you were going to go on Smokey, but you couldn't make it.
Yeah, we had email problems.
We can jump into a little abiogenesis here if you want.
Hey, Sal, I've actually got a question for you, man.
In fact, I'm sorry, John, one sec. Guys, if you want to have that even talk right now, because you're both free, I'll go open a stream right this second.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we can show you all the problems with abiogenesis because there's many.
All right.
Okay.
Or
All right,
it's nice meeting you, P Tango. I'm sorry we couldn't have a longer talk.
No, it's cool.
I'm gonna go start a
Nice to meet you,
stream
Stel.
right now. I will see you guys over there. Okay.
All right.
All right.
Okay.
Take care. Bye, Smokey. Bye, Tony.
These two
No
are
worries.
they're gonna go have a
Good night, John boy.
madness. All right, hey Sal. So I got a question for you. So have you, in your research, have you read anything or looked at anything in regards to the PI RNAs and the
Oh goodness, no.
PIWA Argonaut proteins?
No, but I am familiar with Argonaut and microRNA, but I'm not with the PIWI interacting RNAs. No.
Okay, so I'll send you a link to this. So I watched a hour presentation from last year from Dr. I forget the guy's name from Stanford, and it was titled something to the effect of basically a new paradigm in gene regulation. And what he was presenting was rather fascinating, my friend, because it showed that the PI pathway was causing regulation. They followed the proverbial rabbit trails, and they had discovered that these, in conjunction with microRNAs and mRNAs, were actually regulating transposons, pseudogenes, and other non-coding regions. Okay, now get this. Guess what they realized regarding pseudogenes, as an example. You know how there is no point for this, right? What they realized was the pseudogenes, quote unquote, the reason they weren't seeing the matchup in genes, like traditional DNA genes, is because they don't match up with that. They match up with post-modified mRNAs. Yeah, buddy. Yeah. So they weren't even looking in the right spot prior to, like, in terms of figuring out what the functions were.
I'm gonna put that on my BioExtravagance website. I have a new website. It's just pure science. I mean, I'm not promoting creationism directly. I'm just saying, look at all the wow in biology. And I'd like to thank you for reading that and finding that.
Yeah, I'll put you this way. So
we're getting to the point. We need a pool of people to specialize in each segment of biology. And then when they find something wow that's really embarrassing to evolutionary biology, they need to throw it on the table just like you did today. I did not know that. Oh my goodness. Man,
I'll tell you this much. What
was the date of the paper, if you know it?
Well, the paper, I haven't read the whole paper yet. I watched an hour-long video presentation at Stanford from the head of the research group.
Do you remember his name?
There was April 11th of last year, I believe.
Do you remember his name?
No, but I can say in a second. Hang on. Let's see.
RNA, Stanford, and this is transposons.
The title. Hang on, I'm pulling up my history. Give me 1 second. I will tell you. Okay.
I can only guess.
Let's see.
Was it?
It's HAIFAN Lin. Haflan Lin. HAIFAN. New word LIN. It's the PIWI PIWI PI-RNA pathway, a new paradigm of gene regulation.
Oh, you good. Pee-wee pi RNA pathway. Haifan Lin is a Chinese-born stem cell biologist. I'm sorry, I have to rub this in. He's not an evolutionary biologist. If you want to learn, if you want a guy to make a breakthrough, don't study evolutionary biology. I'm sorry, that's so mean to say that.
Yeah.
Haifan Lin. Oh my goodness.
Another example of evolution holding us back.
Oh my goodness.
Evolution.
Oh, you hit the jackpot, buddy. Oh my goodness. Let me just I'm gonna just save his Haifan Lin. I need to. Oh, this is too good. Let me put that in my. I'm gonna look this up because I need to put this on my Bio Extravagance website. You made my day, John.
Yeah, man. When I came across that, it was a oh wow moment.
Oh wow.
Yeah, I'll tell you this much, my friend. By the end of that video, I was just like, oh wow, because it's probably like 45 minutes in. He's like, now I'm going to get to the most interesting part, and he starts breaking down the whole aspect of junk DNA, and then showing how the PI RNA pathways literally regulate every portion of the genome, and showing direct action between the types being coordinated by the PI RNAs. I was like, what? Okay.
Nobel Prize.
Yeah, baby. See, this is. I mean, a lot of evolutionary biologists like, well, you didn't study evolutionary theory. It's like, yeah, I don't want to waste my time, and I've wasted too much of my life studying it. This is real stuff. You know, it's really, it's really kind of what I don't like is before they even understand something, they'll put an evolutionary narrative on what it does. They'll say it's junk. That's usually the default. And it's like, you guys aren't helping. You're just making. I'll just see practically when I Google like a transposon, I'll just see all the evolutionary spam, just the same narrative, not one iota of insight. And then some guy like these guys actually do experiment and they're able to see that we were just told, basically we're just given a story that was made up. And
yeah, it was very interesting listening to his. It was very interesting listening to his exposition on the whole subject of just the piece that really got me was the impact during the mRNA maturation process, and then its impact on translation.
Oh yeah.
I mean, to me, when you think about that, and I mentioned this earlier, but just the whole aspect of how we were not seeing it. It's like we were literally looking in the wrong spot. It's a literal example of the not seeing the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
Like we were looking 2 steps too early.
This video is like a year old, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it was like April 11th. I think is when he was making his presentation.
Wow.
And something. Where does he work? The Yale School of Medicine.
Well, he actually in the video he actually made a whole like a pretty big comment towards the end of like the impact they were anticipating in relation to cancer research.
Yeah. See, these are the people I've been trying to say, these are the disciplines. This is where real science is. Evolutionary biology, it's like they're just telling stories, and it'd be okay if the stories were credible. And they had this junk DNA story for a long time, and that's losing credibility. I hope we make sure that we never we never let them forget that whole idea came out of their discipline and how it was considered the biggest mistake in molecular biology. The biggest. It didn't come from creationists. It came from evolutionary biologists. The biggest mistake in molecular biology.
The worst thing is but we could have told them that too, probably.
Hey, yeah, sidebar. So, do you have the, the nucleotide linkage problem?
The nucleotide what?
The linkage problem. Do you have the whole, like, they can't get more than about 60, 65?
Yes, it's in Changed Hands book.
Okay. It is in our book? Okay. The I'm wanting to get a...
Why don't I read it to you? I mean, because this is great advertising. So if you want me to, I can read parts of it. I'm happy to, and this maybe some of our faithful viewers will buy Change's book because she needs encouragement, and she is a professor of molecular. Just for the reader's benefit, for the viewers' benefit, she is a professor of molecular biology at a secular school. She's Harvard trained, postdoc, Ivy League. She used to be an atheist. She became a Christian and then became a creationist when she started studying molecular biology. And so she wrote a book on the origin of life. The name of the book is Stairway to Life. And so what John Maddox was just asking now was, where is it that it can only make 65 nucleotides? Oh, wait, I know what you're saying. That's not the linkage. That's when we already have, that presumes we have nucleotides.
Oh, that's
right.
The right kind.
Right.
That's the wrong video?
No. No, the Jungle, were you on the other week when I got into it with Doc Savage?
Yeah, I remember Doc Savage when he was on, I think, yeah.
Okay, so do you remember when the whole point he and I were going back and forth on in regards to he was claiming that he had synthesized kilobases of synthetic DNA, and I kept pinning him down on, did you do it from scratch, or were you using existing enzymes? Were you modifying an existing DNA strands, all that kind of stuff? And he kept dodging, and then finally admitted that yes, that was exactly what he was doing. The point I was calling him out on is what Sal's talking about now, of in the lab without using pre-existing stuff and without the enzymes and everything, assuming you have the nucleotides, they can't get more than 60, 65 of them to stick together before it collapses, unless they go and stitch it together with another strand. Is that a fair summation there, Sal?
Can you repeat again? I was trying to multitask here, which I'm terrible at doing.
Oh, no, I was just talking about the problem that we're discussing right now on the nucleotide linkage is if they don't have enzymes and other things to work with, and they just have the nucleotides and they're trying to piecemeal them together to create a strand, they get to about 60 and it just starts to dissolve unless they stitch it together using enzymes to another strand.
Yes. I don't recall where I specifically got the number 65. It's somewhere in it's in Changed Hands book. They did talk about where they had one kilobase cassettes, which are just they got it up to 1,000, but then they had to construct 1,000 from 65. And I'm really sorry I don't have the. Oh, here it is. Even with careful selective activation and protection of functional groups, interfering side reactions cannot be avoided, and errors in the DNA sequence are relatively common. In a published report, oligos up to about 100 nucleotides can be routinely synthesized with error rates of approximately 1 in 200 nucleotides, although more recent results likely exceed this performance. Because of the errors and the incomplete yield of each reaction cycle, the yield of the final desired product decreases with each added nucleotide, and the length of synthesized oligos must be limited. Upon completion of the synthesis, high-performance liquid chromatography is applied to separate the desired oligos from the undesired molecules that were produced by erroneous reactions. For these reasons, each 1 kilobyte cassette had to be divided into multiple overlapping oligos, mostly in the range of 65 to 100 base pairs.
Uh-huh.
So basically, the error. So basically, the error rate gets so high that it becomes pointless.
Yes, and what do they have to do at each step? Okay, so just think about a DNA making a new cell in either through mitosis. So the cell splits; it has to make a copy of its genome. We do that with very great fidelity, and our genomes, 3.3 gigabases, are huge. This one, what they have to do is they go like 100 at a time. Then they have to do some process of filtering to make sure and double checking to make sure they actually got what they think they want to get, what they're trying to get. So like if they have a computer program and say, this is the sequence we want, they try to build it, and then they have to double check that they actually built it, because otherwise it's not going to work. And it's only 65 to 100. On top of that, you can't stitch them end to end. You have to have them overlap because of this problem of errors. So then when you get up to 1,000 kilobases, then you double check again to make sure you got what you think you were aiming for. Now, interesting story. Craig Ventnor was just trying to get like 500,000 bases correct, and the creature died. It took him 1 or 2 years to figure out what was wrong. It was one error, one nucleotide in a DNA synthesis gene, and the whole creature was dead. One nucleotide. And this process is really, really slow. It's painfully slow when they're doing it in the lab. So, how are they going to synthesize functional genes this way? So anyway,
well, and that's what I find so interesting in the context of people like the Doc Savage guy who claims he's a researcher doing all this stuff in the lab, and I've synthesized kilobases of synthetic DNA and all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, okay, so are you modifying an existing strand? That's a totally different ballgame. It's totally different. You're not even in the same. It's not even in the same stratosphere, buddy. You're using CRISPR and some other components like that to add some stuff in to an existing strand, like totally different dynamic, man.
That's very dishonest, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, why don't can I share my screen? Dr. Chan's diagram that describes the process.
Yeah, please.
Maybe it will mean something to the readers if they actually see. And
just
I want to thank our faithful viewers. Let me see, screen number 2. Yeah, there it is. There it is. That's the this is the process. So let me see where there are all these. Whenever you see like a different step, so you have 1, 2, step 3, 4, 5. You have this deep protection. That means you're taking your chemical soup and removing a chemical, and then you have to then you add a chemical, then you remove that one, and then you add another chemical and remove that, and then you're changing the temperature and pH along the way. That's just to add one nucleotide, then rinse and repeat.
That's for one nucleotide?
That's for one nucleotide. So what they have to do, let me see, deprotection, coupling. So they take the desired nucleotide, this is actually called a DMTO because it's not exactly like a real living nucleotide. It's a synthetic. I can't pronounce the name off the top of my head. So you want to have the correct base here. So ACTG, and then you do this chemical reaction. So let's see, unreacted terminal. So you have to do an acetylation here and capping of unreacted monomer. Then you put something to protect it so it doesn't blow apart. And then you keep doing some more. And when you reach step 5, congratulations, you've added one important nucleotide.
Man, this
is what's really funny. What do you have to do? Yeah, let's say you wanted to add the G, which is guanine. What you have to do now is remove all the G from your test tube, so to speak, and then add the next nucleotide, let's say adenine. So now you add the adenine, you have this protection group. Now you have to remove the protection group so this new adenine can be added, and it goes through some more steps. Once you've added it, you have to cap it and protect the DNA from any further reaction. All right, because then you're going to shake up the test tube, and you don't want your DNA to blow apart, so to speak. This is figuratively speaking. So now that you capped it, you protected your DNA because you don't want to accidentally do a backspace chemistry-wise and delete what you just added. So then you put this capping, and you're ready to add the next. So what do? Then you remove all the adenine out of the test tube. You add your next one. Let's say it's cytosine, and rinse and repeat. This is a very, very slow process. I mean, in living creatures, this just zips by. This is just like at supersonic speed, so to speak, figuratively speaking. But it's painful. And I'm just like, okay, you just think, now this is an artificial man-made process. It's not like in a living creature or even in an origin of life scenario. But this was the best that they could come up with to do this from real scratch. This was difficult. So you can imagine all the ways that this could go wrong. And that's why DNA doesn't form. See, the thing is, you want to have a linear polymer. If you don't do this, you can end up having the DNA, the nucleotides kind of just clumped together rather than having one long chain. I mean, you could imagine that if you're just even using like the man-made chain, right. You can connect it all sorts of ways and do it wrong, and you don't have a nice long linear chain. This is a known problem. And this is assuming you have nucleotides that have the right ribose, the right chirality, and the base is connected. Change 10 did a calculation that just connecting an adenine to a cytosine the correct way, there's 16,000 ways to do it wrong. If you just start out with a phosphate group, a ribose, and a base, 16,000 ways to do it wrong. Only one way to do it right.
That kind of puts the odds. The odds start to get pretty bizarre, especially when you factor in from a sequence perspective. It's okay. I mean, the improbability is already insane just from the sequence logic standpoint, and then you're having to factor in the chemical bonding process. I mean, because heck, just let's see, what a 1,000 base pair sequence is going to be what? That's was it 4 to the 1,000th power? Just to get it right at that point. Before you factor in the 16,000 possible wrong bondings of each base pair. That's and what I find funny about that is it's just a hydrogen bond.
No.
Yeah, that's what we always hear. I mean, obviously there's a phosphate bond too, but I've pointed that to folks before, and they're like, I'm like, yes, I understand. There's a hydrogen bond between I get it, and the phosphate back. Yes, okay, got it. And people don't seem to comprehend. It's what I find interesting. It's very often the chemists that try to downplay the significance of this whole thing, and I'm like,
I would say some of the.
How are you downplaying this? You should know this is hard. You know.
So I think I have a picture here where I could illustrate the problem. I did it with Scrabble letters. Let me see if I have it. I hope I. Oh, okay. Here, I'm trying to illustrate. Let me. If you'll indulge me, I'll share my screen again. And in case you're curious why I'm trying to learn organic chemistry. I actually learned biochemistry. I haven't learned organic chemistry. I had to get special permission from my instructor, so that I could do that. But let me see where I'm. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. And so I have these Scrabble letters here. So you can see that they're just piled up. They're not in any readable form. I'm not even talking about getting them so that they could be read correctly. But let's just say that this is the desired sequence. It's very simple in Scrabble. Ledger as in Heath Ledger. There, or accounting ledger. So if I have some of the Scrabble letters kind of in different orientations, or if they're not the right chirality, it starts to be kind of like not so easy to read. For DNA to be read, it has to be. So what you're talking about, we're not even talking about the sequence. We just want to get them all on the same row, like this. Oriented right. Then you can read it. That's not even whether you have sequence. This is just being able to get something that has half a chance of being read, because otherwise, all the translation machinery and all the replication machinery is just going to jam, and creature's dead. That's why I want to look into DNA repair mechanisms, because I think if we have like double strand breaks and they're never repaired, your creature's dead. I mean. So when it's trying to do a replication and it just hits that, it's just like a bridge that you just blew out. You blew up and you can't go any farther. It's going to be a train wreck after that.
Oh, hey, Sal, sidebar before I forget this. Something else you're going to find interesting about that pi-RNA stuff.
Yeah.
It also has massive impact on methylation. Like major epigenetic regulatory impact.
This is huge.
Oh man, he was showing all the their studies, and it was like, okay, cool. So when we knocked out this, here was the outcome, and I'm talking massive modification, like different and just stunning difference in the outcome. I mean, it was big time, and it was either in complete reduction or dramatic overexpression. It wasn't just like, oh, we had minor modification. It was either like total failure or total overdrive. Either way, it was negative.
I just found, I knew of these, but what I learned at the NIH was microRNAs. They mentioned pi-RNAs in passing. So a peewee interacting RNA, I'm just reading this from Wikipedia, pi-RNA is the largest class of small non-coding RNA molecules expressed in animal cells. Pi-RNAs from RNA protein complexes interact with peewee subfamily Argonaut proteins. These pi-RNA complexes are mostly involved in the epigenetic and post-transcriptional silencing of transposable elements and other spurious repeat-derived transcripts, but can also be involved in the regulation of other genetic elements in the germline cells. Oh my goodness. This doesn't exist in other domains of life outside of the animal kingdom. This is really bad for evolution, because if they're critical for life, how did they just kind of end up in an animal, especially for the complexity of what you're controlling?
And get this. So there's the 1,000 families of miRNAs. 16 million pi-RNAs.
Ooh. Yeah.
Yeah. So the researcher, he actually did a direct comparison to miRNAs. He's like, okay, so here's why this is so important. So here's the microRNAs we know of. Here's the deal, yada yada yada. And then he's like, here is what we've discovered so far. There's 16 million of them that we've found so far. I mean, think about that. 1,000. Okay, as you and I both know, the microRNAs are important, very important.
But even even just evolving 1,000 of them that's a huge leap. That's why I say let's just assume common descent from the sake of argument. You still need miracles to make it work. And all those phylogenetic reconstructions don't explain the origin of these orphan systems, these taxonomically restricted systems. Just doesn't make sense.
No, it really doesn't.
The phylogenetic tree is gibberish more and more. It's just nonsense.
Well, what I'm going to be very fascinated to see on this, I've already started to go down the rabbit holes with the microRNAs of the way that they are starting to, present some rather significant incongruity for phylogeny in the first place. I can only imagine what the piRNAs are going to. I'm just going to gamble that that's going to throw a whole new wrench in phylogeny. That's my guess.
Well, I may differ from you and maybe the rest of the Standing for Truth crew. I'd say the phylogenetic quote unquote reconstructions are not horrible. I mean, I've often said the best proof for common design is if we prove Noah's flood is recent. It's a done deal at that point. That's the easier way, because I do see kind of like tree-like structures, and we are more similar to other primates than we are trees, but they do have problems. What I'd say is if we assume common descent, you need all these miracles to make this work, and so that's why personally I don't go after these inconsistencies in the phylogenetic reconstructions.
Well, see, the only reason I don't have an issue with it inside of the family. I got no issue with that with phylogeny. I think it probably actually makes sense inside of family and genus. Once you go outside of that, I think it starts to get very weird, and the inference requirement gets rather interesting, in my opinion.
Yeah, because I was talking to a guy about the Precambrian, and they're trying to make a tree going back into the igneous rock, and if it's not into the igneous rock, it's between the sand grains of the unconformity, that you have billions and billions of years. It just doesn't make sense.
But I agree with you on that. And the real thing that gets me on the phylogeny stuff is when you actually look at what is being required for their model inference on some of the stuff. It's like, I don't discount for 1 second that it's evidence for design that yes, there's a very similar function that has similar, core components, but then there's massive variation. It's like, okay, cool. I used a foundational component and then modified the heck out of it for an entirely different outcome. I'm not really sure how you're arguing that this is in favor of evolution, or the ancestral, the lineage perspective applies in this context, especially when I was looking at something the other day and and I mentioned this to you in passing, Sal. I was looking at the into the titin and the actin proteins and everything, of how they were less similar for the first half of basically they were less the protein structure was less similar before they diverged per the evolutionary timeline. They became more similar after the divergence. Like, how does that make any logical sense? You would think it would be more similar at the earlier stage, not the later stage. I
looked it up. Yeah, thank you for that titin protein. again, personally, I'm very interested in stuff with Noah's flood because this will just make everything just moot.
Yeah, I agree that we got to focus on the Noah's flood. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, John, I saw someone Iron Charioteer. I feel I need to respond to this.
Okay.
He said John Maddox was actually made clueless by Erica by asking him what phospholipid membranes were. John did not know what they are. That doesn't matter. What she cited, and since I wasn't in the debate, and since Erica was going to be a moderator on a debate that was coming up, I wanted to be nice, and then also I'd like to stay on good terms with her. I don't, I try not to pile on too much, but she cited something. This is not her fault. This is the fault of the Origin of Life research community, which James Tour said Origin of Life research is retarded. And one example of that is this claim of phospholipids, that they can create lipid bilayers or mycelials. That's true kind of in an Origin of Life scenario. But the problem is, what happens if you have what if you have this lipid bilayer or membrane? Basically you have this kind of spherical shaped thing, and it can contain stuff. If stuff can't go in and out, you've created a coffin. Without transmembrane proteins, whatever junk is inside that cell is going to be more dead after millions of years. It's not going to evolve to anything. I don't know how these Origin of Life researchers can say that this suggests how the first life evolved when what they've described is a coffin. They shouldn't be advertising this scientific progress in figuring out the origin of life. They've actually shown a good example of why it'd be dead. And James Tour called them out on it. And I'm glad he did. He was making fun of a Nobel Prize winner. So sorry about that, John. I didn't mean to wreck your train of thought, but I just didn't want to let that one go.
Oh no, it's fine. I mean, and to be honest, I mean, I'd done a previous debate, and when she was talking about cell wall stuff, I had actually read a study on, because I think people forget this, because what I actually referred to in my debate with her was a cell wall protein. Because I think a lot of these idiots forget there's actually proteins that are inside of cell walls, and
maybe about 40%
actions.
actual lipids. It's proteins and carbohydrates.
Right. And what I had read in terms of Origin of Life stuff, in terms of self-replication, was they had found some, and I couldn't really think of the name off the top of my head, but they had found a cell wall protein they were able to get to self-replicate. And it was like 42, I think I said this in the debate, it was like 42 amino acids long or something to that effect. And they were talking about it being, evidence of, for abiogenesis. And, so, I mean, it's, yeah, anyway. But I agree with your point on oh, cool, you created a portion of a cell wall. Awesome. That's,
Well, what's really bad is the way that they described it when it would basically engulf something. It's like, great, you just made a coffin. Spontaneously assembled a coffin. It ain't gonna live. Guaranteed.
Yeah, they love to get into the whole, the phospholoids and all these different things. And it's like, yeah, okay, cool. You've got your hydrolysis, and I mean, it's like, what cracks me up about a lot of their arguments, it's like, okay, cool. So you found something that if it's not in water, it'll do, if it's in this scenario, it will replicate. But then if you stick it in water, then it will dissolve, or vice versa. It's like, okay, so what? This first reaction happened, then somehow it magically sprung out of your primordial soup to do the next stage of the chemical process? Get out of here, man. It's I don't take you seriously if you're actually going to make that argument of with no intelligent agent, how is this a remotely plausible argument that you're making.
Exactly, and yet people take it seriously enough to keep giving grants and publishing it in peer-reviewed papers. The honest thing to say, you say, well, we did this reaction. We don't know if it's relevant, whether it is viable. The honest thing to say is we do not, we can only state this reaction, and we don't know if it's the path, if it's a viable path toward the origin of life. That's honest. What is not honest to say this suggests a way that life could have evolved. Terrible.
Yeah, I think at this point it's a very obvious. If, in spite of what the atheist activists love to say and try and argue that there is no actual connection between abiogenesis and evolution, you and I both, we all know that they actually are recognizing it. I mean, they put it in their papers now, like that the separation between chemical evolution, i.e., abiogenesis, and biological evolution are not. There is not that clear line of demarcation that the atheist activists like to espouse, and I think they recognize that the more issues they're running into with neo-Darwinism in general, if they concede even for a moment that abiogenesis is not even a remotely plausible concept, then every aspect of the status quo will collapse. Like they will no longer be able to maintain the facade of it being, proven beyond all doubt. The way they like to present it will no longer be valid, even inside of their own academic towers, if you will. You're on mute, Sal.
Yeah, on mute.
Sal, you're on mute, buddy.
Sorry about that. We can even beat them at their own game. Just let's assume that they're separate. So let's talk about the major transitions, like from prokaryote to eukaryote. And then I've been looking at some of the other transitions. The next one would be meiosis. And Kent Hovind, who actually sparked this whole after show, he mentioned in passing, what good is a nerve muscle system if it's not all there at once? And I saw kind of the same problem. What good is a neuron just floating around in a creature's body if it doesn't do anything?
Well, it's interesting. They love to use the environmental pressures argument, and I'm like, if you don't have the function, there is no environmental pressure to add it, modify it, improve it. It doesn't exist yet. Therefore, how is there even remotely the pressure that you're arguing is required? And it's like, oh well, it would just happen. Like, what? No. This is that as Sal, as you and I talked about a while back in terms of the muscle proteins. I'm like, wait a minute. I'll never forget when I was reading that paper and it talked about how they phylogeny showed that these proteins first evolved in unicellular organisms. And I'm like, in what scenario is there any remote plausibility that the proteins that are required for muscles somehow had the appropriate environmental pressures to evolve in a unicellular organism? Please tell me. I do not know how that is a remotely plausible conclusion. Am I missing something? It's late, so I may be missing something, but am I out to lunch on that one? Anything you guys can think of that would explain that supposed logic?
I did look at the paper, and there is the idea of domains where something can be reused, and ironically that it does tie to protein moonlighting. So I wouldn't be too quick to dismiss The evolutionary biologists will put up a speed bump. I wouldn't say it's an impenetrable barrier.
The most okay, hang on. I get what you're saying, but the most complicated, most advanced, readily accepted to be such protein, it was just moonlighting. I mean, come on. You're telling me that the 27 to 34,000 amino acid protein was moonlighting? Come on. I mean, I'm not suggesting they might not make that argument. I'm just saying make the argument, and then let's go. You're saying you're not you. I'm saying rhetorically, like you're saying that the most, per your own admission, the most complicated protein that there is, which is also one of the most fundamental, somehow evolved in a unicellular organism when it didn't have all the environmental pressures that would. What was it doing beforehand? Especially given the fact that we now know that point mutations in this protein result in its collapse, and we directly tie it to all sorts of diseases. A single point mutation. So I'm just saying.
What about the formation of light-sensitive cells connected to the nerve cells and stuff? Just happened.
You have a point there. I mean, yeah, if it's not connected to a nerve cell, where's it going to go? And if the nerve cells aren't connected to something that's going to utilize it, where does that go?
I mean, you made the point of like, what if there is nothing to connect the neuron to? What's the point of the neuron? And
there's really interesting because there are different kinds of neurons. There are neurons that are sensory, and then there's like the motor ones. And in human beings, they're just huge varieties. So you have basically you could use a wire to, in the man-made world, you can use wires to sense electricity and to also send electricity. But then you have all sorts of varieties of how you can hook up all these electronic components. So the neuroscience of this is really interesting. There was a point I was going to make. It slipped my mind. I guess it's getting late.
Well, as you were mentioning the last week, Sal, the whole aspect there's now just starting to get into with the glycome.
Oh yeah.
I was reading some stuff on that, and like the glycans and everything. To be honest, I was just kind of cracking up while I was reading a bunch of this stuff, not in a like derisive way, but more of just of a entertainment. In like, haha, look at this, a whole nother layer of stupidly complicated. Who knows what is going to be discovered in the not too distant future that's going to continue to just eviscerate their positions. And to me, when you really think about the potential impact of glycomics on the entire, macro explanation requirements of evolution, I mean, there's no telling what kind of an ultimate KO punch that's going to be to the entire premise.
Oh yeah, and I don't think it's going to end. There are layers of complexity we don't even perceive. And one thing I could this is an empirically testable hypothesis. Evolutionary biologists will find a way to say that it doesn't matter, or that it's junk, or it serves no function, or it's bad design.
Well, they may make that. That argument wouldn't surprise me, but at this point, I mean, I think it's just using the microRNAs, and now apparently the pi RNAs, and the rest of this stuff was junk DNA. Oh wait, now we're finding out most of it's, a bunch of it isn't. I mean, the layers, each layer of the onion that gets peeled away, as you mentioned, right, represents a even greater layer of complexity that is required. And whether or not the staunch atheists and evolutionary biologists want to concede, I think in the not too distant future, the average person is going to start to question of just, Like, wait a minute, what? I mean, it's already starting to happen to some extent for the few people who are aware and actually starting to, go into things with an open mind. I mean, plenty of people are starting to recognize, like, wait a minute, this is just dumb. I mean, it's being recognized to an extent.
Oh, I remembered now what I wanted to say. You said, do you think that'll, that might be the knockout punch? And the question that I posed to some evolutionists or naturalists or atheists, short of you seeing the miracle with your own very eyes, would you be willing to accept a miracle as an explanation for something you can't see? And that usually settles it, where their heart is. And so the problem that they're faced with, so I mean, like someone like Speed of Sound, he said, well, I'd like an explanation how it all works. And so the problem with that is, let's suppose the explanation is beyond any human understanding. I mean, we can barely comprehend what we already know about biology, and no one individual could understand it. So how much more difficult will it be to ever have an explanation that a human being, but just on a matter of principle, would someone, I mean, we tend to believe what we'll understand, but are there things that the correct answer might be, it's a miracle that's beyond human understanding and forever will be? It'll be forever outside of our ability to prove, because unless you have the powers of God and you can create life, you're going to have to trust that a miracle was the origin. And that's the real crux of the matter. Are they willing to believe in something that is beyond them, which means it's something that they can't control, they can't repeat, they can't make life on demand, which really almost says that they're only going to believe in God unless they're God themselves. And I'm like, okay, let's just cut to the chase what you really, really mean. And so what they'll always do is they say, well, you've offered no proof. So we keep showing all this complexity, and they'll say, well, that's not proof. And it's like, well, fine. If I can get them to actually articulate what would constitute proof, they give a naturalistic answer. I said, okay, that's exactly the problem. You'll only accept an answer where you could make life yourself, basically. Where you had the power, you would have the description of how you could do it yourself, but you're not going to believe it if it really was a miracle of God. So,
well, the funny part about that is what you're describing there. I agree with you completely in terms of, I mean, it's the embodiment of human arrogance and the desire to escape the requirement and therefore the accountability of God's existence, or accountability to God if he exists. But what I find interesting, very interesting about this whole subject, earlier yesterday actually, I was watching a interview or quasi debate between who was the co-author of Stairway to Life, Rob Stadler.
Rob Stadler, yeah.
So I watched. He did last month. He did a little quasi debate with John Perry on his YouTube channel, and it was very interesting going through that, like observing that debate of just, number one, the level of ego in the guy's voice and just language and everything. I mean, the ego was just dripping, which was funny because the reason I came across this interview was he done another video on why the genetic code is a code, right? It was like breaking down information theory, all these different pieces, right? And the irony was that he was talking about how atheists need to stop denying the fact that it's a code. Okay. So I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. This guy's kind of open mind, and because I thought I was like listening to myself, because he was breaking down communication theory, information theory, the different facets of it, why it's a code, why it constitutes one, everything. I'm like, wow, I'm listening to myself here, And then I go and watch his interview with Rob Stadler, and then he starts going on this whole tangent about how among a variety of different things, but one of them was that signal theory enabled the removal of the requirement of the intelligent agent to create a code, because we have observed signaling be developed and modified in living organisms. And I'm like, wait a minute. Your argument to remove the intelligent agent component from the thing that you freely admit and will defend and argue fulfills all the definitions of this is because we've seen a totally complete system being able to make modifications. Like it already exists. Like, okay, cool. So this organism that has an aspect of intelligence and a complete system is able to come up with a new signal. How does this remove the source requirement for what enables them to be able to make that modification? You know, and blew my mind of just but the part that got me more than anything though was his interaction with Rob, of just the way he was acting like he didn't know anything. Just the John Perry guy was acting like Rob didn't know anything. And I'm like,
it's interesting.
The guy is literally like, you're telling the scientist he's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, okay, wow. Talk about ego.
Yeah, I didn't want to suffer through that. I couldn't suffer through that whole discussion. I only got through half of it. So you probably saw something that was really distasteful. But I couldn't suffer because he said, "Oh, I'm willing to accept intelligent design if we could have a research program." I just wanted to say that's exactly the problem that I just talked about. He'll only accept an explanation where he could repeat it in the lab and build it and understand it and comprehend it.
Well, what's funny about that too is it was amazing to me, his ego in the context of, like, he wasn't being able to grasp the entire point that was being made with the perpetual motion machine thought experiment. Did you hear that part of their conversation?
Go ahead and repeat that part. I think I'm afraid.
Okay, so basically what Rob was saying was, okay, so if we came across a perpetual motion machine, like, what would your response be? Right? And it's like, well, eventually, he was making the point that, well, we know that that a perpetual motion machine isn't possible, right? So obviously you wouldn't go and research and spend all this time trying to recreate a perpetual motion machine because we know they're not actually possible, right? From a thought experiment perspective. The point he was making was, okay, we don't know everything, but we now know that the requirements for abiogenesis have reached the point where it's like saying life creating itself without an intelligent agent is the equivalent of a perpetual motion machine being possible. So if you'd be considered an idiot to go after and chase down, spend all this money to research trying how to build one of these things, it's the exact same concept in regards to abiogenesis. And the John Perry guy just kept going off on how, like, it was like he could not put two and two together.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, you're just God of the gaps. He's like, no, I'm not making a God of the gaps argument. I'm saying we've now reached the point that just like we wouldn't go chase after trying to build a perpetual motion machine, which we know defies the laws of physics, it's the exact same premise. He was like, he was not computing, or his ego was so large that he refused to admit it.
Oh, now I know what there's the other part of the question I wanted to pose to you. I'm not saying that there's a right or wrong answer. I believe God of the gaps is actually a good argument. It's not God of, like, our lack of knowledge. It's just like you said, there comes a point that you just don't look for any more perpetual motion machines. It's the wrong. You're looking for the wrong explanation for something. And so I wanted to ask you if you, I know it has such kind of a bad connotation to say God of the gaps, but I'm just like, well, if if I were that blind man in the account of John chapter 9 who got healed, to me that's a God of the gaps argument. That's why he believed Jesus was the Messiah. So I was just like, how big does a gap have to be before someone will accept it as being a miracle of God? Some people say they'll be, when they're really honest, they'll say there's no gap too big. Yeah, it's like, okay, when are you going to just say this is just too big?
Yeah.
And a lot of people will just say there's no size.
No, I agree with you, and I think I agree that we've reached that point. And when people talk about the arguments for the argument from incredulity, and I'm like, no, my incredulity, yes, it's an argument of incredulity for me now. I'm incredulous that you're this dumb and cannot see the obvious.
Yeah.
That like, I'm incredulous at you, not at the argument. I'm incredulous that you cannot see the point and the argument that's being made in the context that you were just talking about of like, hey, we've reached the point of like, get out of town, man. Whether it be the sheer improbabilities from a pure math standpoint, or the just are you kidding me from the chemistry perspective? And just are you kidding me from the information requirement? All those different facets that we're talking about in terms for life to exist. And to me, when any one of those many facets by itself is enough to reach the point you're making, right? This isn't a God of the gaps from I don't want to look for answers. It's we've been looking, and now this is the logical conclusion.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think any one of those facets we just talk, the information, the improbability, the chemistry, the physics. I mean, all those factors, just any one of them is enough, in my opinion, for it to be like get out of here. You're an idiot. What fantasy land are you living in?
See, and I try to stop them. They said that's an argument from incredulity. I'll say that's an argument from contradiction. It's because it's like you guys are saying that a tornado can pass through a junkyard and you're going to get something functional of a complexity like a 747. That's just not believable. And so this Earth that has all these randomizing events, you're asking, they're asking me to believe this can spontaneously assemble. And we know that even if we take a cell that has all its parts and you just kind of disassembled it in just a little bit, it'll die. It's not going to reassemble. In that cell, you'll have better lipids, better carbohydrates, better RNAs, DNAs, and proteins than you would in all the origin of life scenarios put together. And if it's just a little bit out of kilter, that thing's dead. It doesn't spontaneously become life. How they could say that then that they did this little measly experiment and says this suggests how life can emerge, and just like, no, that's not telling the truth.
It doesn't even almost start. I mean, there's no almost mechanism there.
Oh, by the way,
directed working mechanism. Yeah.
I wanted to say congratulations on your retirement. I forgot to mention that.
Oh,
we're all envious
I
of
worked
you.
30 years at one company, and some 10 years before that.
And you were doing machine or
mechanic, technician, tech ops for an airline.
Oh, airlines! Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on job well done. That's marvelous. Yep.
God I guess you had a perfect timing to, with all this madness, if you were working for the airline, probably perfect timing to be retiring for you.
Right, because they made an offer and I accepted it, and so I'm just taking whatever they're giving me.
Well done, sir. Well done.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, that's a. Yeah. Whew, I'm very fascinated to see what ends up happening with the airline industry. Like, obviously, long term, I think it'll be fine. Long term. But in the short term, I mean, I'm like, man, there's no way that airlines can last another, more than a couple more months. I think
they're getting more help. I think
getting more bailout.
Yeah, they're getting loans or something. I think is what they're getting.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting. I know that I saw some articles on Boeing and Airbus have both had over 50% of their orders canceled.
Whoa. Wow, Boeing really messed up just a little while back.
Oh well, they already had their was it the 757?
737 Max.
730. Yep. Yeah, that one. Yeah, they had That was already a borderline KO punch for them, and then this. Oof.
Wow. Yeah.
I saw that coming. I did not. Well, I was in the aviation and defense industry for 20 years, and the idea of this fly-by-wire on passenger airplanes, I said that's fine for a fighter plane where you're trying to push everything to the limit, but then you give up your margin of safety by doing that. And when they said they were doing this on passenger airlines, I was just like, oh man, this is disturbing, because
is that what they were doing on the 737?
Parts of it were fly-by-wire, and just like, guys, it's it's no big deal if you have the blue screen of death on your own personal computer. You don't die. Do you have a little hiccup in an airplane in its software where you flip the bit one way up or down? That could be disaster, and that's figuratively speaking, that's what happened.
Yeah, what I heard, actually, it was a competition with Airbus, because Airbus made a competitive aircraft, and so it tried to match it, but then in doing so, they had to modify the engine, and then when they modified the engine, it affected the handling, and they tried to compensate it with software, and it didn't work. Obviously, it didn't work, right?
So that's how it happened. See,
Yeah.
I like the older style airplanes that were just mechanically based. If something went wrong, you didn't have to worry about dealing with the computers. And there've been some airline crashes that were suspicious, like the Malaysia one. We don't know if there was some electronic failure along the way. I mean, I just don't like the idea that the computer's brain can totally control the airplane. I mean, I understand if it's like a space shuttle or something where you really need precision and a human will have a hard time flying it back. But if you don't need to, don't use it. That's just kind of my. So I saw that coming, and I'm sorry it kind of played out the way I feared. My worst fears were realized. So.
Yeah, because they tried to compensate for the aerodynamics with using software, and then they didn't really tell the pilots, what was going on, or explain or train them, and you saw the result.
Yeah.
I can only imagine what those board meetings were like when when on a global level an entire type of airplane is grounded. Like, I mean, who knows? I'm assuming there was probably thousands of them. Like, oh yeah, we're done. Grounded. And that's can only imagine what that was like.
Yeah, it really affected Boeing, the customers and everything.
Well, I imagine Airbus was probably the Airbus boardroom was probably they were probably cheering and running around busting out the bottles of champagne, thinking, "What? We're about to get some orders, boys!"
They were snickering because it was a response to their whatever they did, with something they did.
Yeah, that's. I definitely think it's gonna be interesting. I saw an article last week that 4th of July air travel was down 70% compared to last year. Which is kind of crazy when you think about that. Down 70%.
Oh, that's a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, John, could I mention some things I saw in the chat?
Yeah, man.
Iron Charioteer says, I consider myself to be a humanist first and an atheist second, evolution has nothing to do with my worldview. And he says, he said somewhere that there's no such thing as an evolutionist. Did he say that?
You know, I get so tired of hearing the moronic atheists say that evolutionist is not actually a word. It is literally in the dictionary. Go use Google and search evolutionist, and it will come up in the dictionary.
If I misquoted you, Iron Charioteer, my apologies. I thought that's what. Anyway, I found something interesting. An evolutionist philosopher, Michael Ruse, and he debated people like Michael Behe and Phil Johnson long time ago. He just came out with a book, Oxford University Press. It's entitled Darwinism as Religion. This wasn't written by a theologian. This is written by a defender of evolutionary biology. Darwinism as religion.
At this point, they don't really have any more shields to hide behind on Scientology, the naturalism that they're trying to push. I mean, it's I think any semblance of, oh, this is just, science. It's like, no, you guys rely on this 100% to defend your evolutionary stance, or your atheist stance and worldview. I mean, there's no other way around it. Let's get real.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how it. I mean, only one person, maybe only a few that I know of that were atheists, believed in some sort of intelligent design. That'd be like Fred Hoyle, and because it's really hard to be an atheist and then acknowledge there had to be intelligent design. Fred Hoyle was the one who came up with the tornado in a junkyard. So he rejected a lot of stuff in evolutionary theory. He was able to maintain his atheism in the face of all that. And he postulated some sort of, like the universe is kind of like God itself, intelligent. Right. So it's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's about the only escape route. But so I found Hoyle to be more honest than others, and at least assessing the difficulty of life forming, because a lot of, when I saw that and I saw a lot of creationists quoting him, I said, yeah, that's understandable, because he's, at least for the first time, we felt someone who was an atheist was really leveling with us, was leveling with the general public as to the difficulty of a natural explanation.
Yeah, the naturalist worldview, to me, has just reached such a level of, just irrationality. All the things that we talk about of, there's engineering, there's electrical engineering, there's information theory, there's communication systems, there's programming. The list goes on and on and on and on of just things that's like, come on, folks. At what point do you stop living in Fantasyland? And we don't even have to talk about religion yet. Like, let's just talk about, do I exist by chance? Yes or no? It's a very foundational question. And they don't even want to address that.
Yeah. Can anything make itself? Not just biology, but can anything make itself?
Well, that's a great point. And the irony for me is when you do pose that question to them, the instant comeback is, well, we're not talking about things that, the things you're comparing this to don't self-replicate. I get so annoyed with that response. Just like, do you guys not recognize there's an entirely additional layer of complexity that's required for the self-replication component of this?
Right.
Do you not grasp this? This makes it harder, not easier.
It's not even a computer with directives. It's a computer that has to reproduce.
I mean, it's like, yes, and part of that reproduction is new code. It's like you have to have new hardware, like replicate the hardware and the software. And then while doing this replication, you're going to both build new hardware and add new functions to the software. Like, this is what you are arguing is being accomplished in the evolutionary model. I do not understand how you view this as a remotely plausible explanation for our existence. I mean, to me, it just goes beyond the shark. In my opinion, the shark was jumped with the discovery of Watson and Crick. I mean, shark has officially jumped the. So what show is that from? Jumping the Shark. Is that Happy Days?
What was that? Jumping the Shark?
Yeah, I was trying to remember which TV show that came from when they jumped the shark on the show. Whatever. It was a long time ago.
Happy Days. That's a long time ago. Happy Days.
Yep. Yeah, it was an old one. What is Charioteer asking? George Bond. Can you constantly observe your nails and hair growing? It's pretty boring, but it happens. Okay, he's having an interesting back and forth. I think George has been having a good time talking trash with Iron Charioteer tonight. They've been going back and forth a couple hours now.
Yeah.
But speaking of that, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. I gotta go to
They
bed.
make up a lot of nonsense. Yeah. John, did you, if you want the computer, you want one with a disk drive or without?
I mean, you have a extra computer?
Laptop, yeah. Or
I mean, if you don't need it, I'll take it off your hands.
How can I get it to you? Can you give me some instructions in an email?
Yeah, I'll shoot you an email. I appreciate that very much, brother. Are you sure you got you don't need this?
Right, I got extra ones. It's a long story.
Okay. Well, I'll take you up on it. I greatly appreciate it. Yeah, I can't believe I still haven't gotten over the fact that the one I had I bought it 8 months ago.
Oh,
stupid thing imploded. But yeah, I'll shoot you an email. I greatly appreciate that, brother.
Okay. Yeah, send me an email and I'll try to get it to you as best I can. You're not far from New Jersey, or are you?
I'm in Nashville.
Yeah, that's a ways. Yeah.
Good old Nashville, Tennessee. Yep. Actually, Nashville's surprisingly. It's actually from a logistic standpoint, it's one of the premier spots in the United States. You can be to any major metro within 4.5 hours, I think.
Yeah, I might be able to go there on the way to Missouri if I wanted to.
Oh yeah, when's the move going down?
When is the well? I might. I'm hoping in the next week or so I'm going to be able to go out to Missouri.
Okay. Well, I mean, you're if you want to make a stop in Nashville on your way out there, I mean, you're more than welcome to spend the night in my house. Might be a nice little break.
Oh yeah, okay. All right. Sounds good.
Yeah, I used to until this madness, I would Airbnb my house. So I've got let's say I lived by myself. I let a couple people stay with me during the shutdown, but I've got beds out the yin yang in my house.
Okay, that's good.
Because I used to rent it out. In summer times, I was usually renting out every weekend. But all the tourists, but that market has just vanished. So
yeah, it's kind of like what happened.
Plenty of place for people to sleep.
was selling on eBay, and then the thing hit, and then I just stopped selling. I don't know when I'm going to start selling again.
Gotcha. Yeah, I tell you what, this whole economy. I tell you what, I'm more worried about than anything. Say worried is relative, but end of this month, when all that federal money goes away, I think people are going to be going into full scale realization of the madness that's going down right now.
Yeah, I hope I get it out to Missouri before then.
Yeah. Yeah, well, Jack Jersey's gonna be interesting for sure up there.
I still have to move, and I have to like sell a house or whatever.
Oh, gotcha. Are there any of those companies up there that are doing the like guaranteed offer stuff?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to buy the house, yeah. There's people that will offer things, yeah.
Yeah. Nashville's such a ridiculously well, at least up until now, the real estate market here has been insane. We were the #1 real estate market in the country last year. And houses just going left and right, but kind of staggered out here all of a sudden. But anyway, well, folks, I got to call tonight and wrap things up. Jungle, as always, appreciate you coming on, man. Everybody in the audience, thank you for going through all this madness. It was quite the adventure tonight. Sal, thank you, as always, my friend. And hope everybody has a great,
very productive night.
Yes.
Yes, it was.
and thanks for all. Yes, thanks to everyone. Thanks, John, for this, and nice seeing you again, Jungle Jargon. So,
yep. Likewise.
God bless.
Good night, everybody.
All right, good night.